All right, great, thank you.
I like it. I will not touch a word to hear.
Oh, technically, I guess I should get started. I
Yeah.
guess I didn't budget
To the time
in there.
Hey, and also we got to do a shout out by end of day for all the ones that are.
Sure.
Good morning, AV Club. Morning. How's it going? Good.
Yeah, I'm about to take this off because I am already late on the schedule. All right. How's everyone doing today? Yeah. Y'all have a good time last night?
I like that enthusiasm back there.
So it's actually really, really great to see a packed room today because I know last night was a lot of fun. A lot of people will go and then just not show up the second day of the conference. You know, maybe they can only take one day off of work. But this room is almost as packed as it was yesterday, and we really appreciate that, and our speakers really appreciate that because today is actually a really important day in DevOps Days. The talks that we chose, are they up on the schedule? Yeah, okay. So we've actually got 5 talks today. That's one more talk than yesterday. And we kind of chose a theme for these talks. These are all areas that are really important, but have been kind of left out of the DevOps conversation previously. We actually dedicated, more than half of the programming at this event to areas like security, to QA teams, areas that, are critical to the DevOps conversation. We talk about them all the time. We're not necessarily bringing in members from those teams to this event. And that's something we've tried to do today with the lineup of talks. Just a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get right into the first talk. For those of you who left early, you may not have heard our announcement. We are actually going to be donating a lot of the money from running DevOps Days because this is not a for-profit event. So when you're paying for a ticket, we're really able to use that for whatever we want to, which is great. And in this case, we decided that we're going to be donating about $15,000 to each of 3 local charities. The Boston Food Bank, Gear Up, and the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. So that's something that your tickets, if your employer paid for those, that our sponsors have helped pay for. We're really able to do something pretty awesome with that money. For today's schedule, we just had it up, but it's going to be 2 talks, a break, 2 more talks, lunch, 1 final talk, and then another round of 3 open spaces. We're going to do a slight change to the open spaces, but we'll talk about that more right before we launch it. Now, I'm going to go introduce our first speaker of the day, Katie Rose. So she's a UI and UX developer at Booz Allen Hamilton. She also has a background of 14 years in operations, which is like longer than I've even been doing programming. But also, another aspect of her background She actually is, she plays women's football, most recently for the New York Sharks as a defensive end. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. Her talk is Gridiron Ops, what women's tackle football can teach us about software delivery. I'm really excited for it. Can you all give her a huge round of applause?
Okay, thank you, James. So, like James said, today we're going to talk a little bit about football, a little bit about DevOps, and how both can cross over and what we can learn from each other. So, the first thing we want to talk about is me. So, my name is Katie Rose. I'm a professional women's football player, most recently for the New York Sharks. I've been playing for about 4 years. I'm a defensive end. I've also played a few other positions: offensive tackle, tight end. I'm a 2014 All-American. I was the marketing director for the Sharks. Professionally, I also worked about 14 years on the operations side. I left that job, started my own startup, which did not succeed, and I went back into developing with Booz Allen. So now I'm a UI UX developer with Booz Allen. So that's all about me, and we can get started. So the reason we're having this conversation is the culture question. We all know that culture is important. The question isn't whether it's important, it's what we do about it. And so this is a really important quote that I found when I was researching for this, and it's from Gartner. Ian Head, the research director at Gartner, estimates that by 2018, 90% of organizations attempting to use DevOps without specifically addressing their cultural foundations will fail. That's 90%. So it's very huge. And we talk a lot about tools. We do talk about culture, but if you don't correctly address that culture, no matter what tools you're using, they will not be successful. So why football? So I know it's probably the biggest reason that it's on the program, and people are like, how is this going to work? So the reason we're talking about football, and this is an important quote from Vince Lombardi, people who work together will win, whether it be against complex football defenses or the problems of modern society. We talk specifically in football, culture is huge. A lot of people call football the ultimate team sport, and that's because of the culture of football. So there's a few overlapping principles. You've got specialization, mission focus. Those are the two that we're going to focus on today. Then you've got teamwork, agility and flexibility, and continuous assessment. Also, another overlap between DevOps and football is that there are a lot of people that have roles that don't ever get the glory. You have your quarterbacks, you have your running backs, you have your receivers. There are a lot of other people on the football field who are doing their jobs with their heads down, grinding out day after day, so that the whole team can be successful. And DevOps is very much the same way. We don't all get the glory, but hopefully we all enjoy the outcome. And why women's football? And this is a really important point. So I don't know how many of you have heard of her. There's a woman named Jen Welter. She's the first female NFL coach. She was an interim coach over the summer or during the offseason for the Arizona Cardinals. She said this quote here, and just to summarize, it's essentially what Vince Lombardi said, but she's saying it as a woman. And why that's important is, as women playing football, right now, the culture is we don't start playing until we're adults. So the cultural shift that's necessary, that football culture where there's a lot of overlaps, we don't learn those things until we're adults. I started playing football when I was 30 years old. So all these things that little boys and young men learn that are critical to football are things that women, grown women with jobs and families, have to take in and do that cultural shift as adults. So that's why Jen Welter's quote is important. She's saying the same thing as Vince Lombardi, but she's saying that as somebody who learned those lessons as a grown-up. So how do we take those same lessons and those same principles and how women adopted them as adults and use those same techniques for helping adults who are in the workforce adopt them for DevOps? So I spoke with one of my previous coaches, Coach LB, LeBryant Robinson. I know that's not how it looks like it's spelled, but it is. I'll show you a little bit, maybe a picture in a minute, but this is what he told me. I spoke to him, I asked him some questions about what he thought, and he said, for women, the culture of football is being learned at an older age, but still plays a major role in the success of women's football. So even the coaches know it. The coaches are addressing this problem because they are teaching women how to be football players as adults rather than children. This, real quick, is just a gratuitous picture of my defensive line. That's my man right there, Coach LB. He's a beast. He was actually in the NFL for a few years. He was drafted by the Skins, played for the Bills, played in the CFL, and now he's the defensive coordinator for the Sharks. So let's get into the meat of it. We've got specialization versus silos. This quote I like a lot because it's really true, and I've seen it happen to a lot of people on the football field. You get hit the hardest when trying to run or hide from a problem. Like the defense on a football field Putting all focus on evading one defender is asking to be blindsided. And that's essentially what we're doing when we're in silos. So I'm going to run down through a few things between silos and specialization. I know that most of you are probably pretty familiar with silos and where the breakdowns occur, but we're going to walk through them to get that contrast between the two. So with silos and specialization both, you have those refined skill sets, right? You have everybody being able to do what they do best. But with silos, you have that limited scope and orbit. You're only working within the confines of what you do best. You don't see everything else that's happening, and you don't have the input and the resources of other people who do other things that well. Whereas you have the big picture with specialization. With silos, you get that good enough. As long as it's good enough to throw it over the fence, right? I knew this guy when I was younger. His quote was, "Good enough for government work." As long as you could throw it over the fence, it was good enough. With specialization, there's no fence. So everything that you send out there is going to be coming back to you. There's this constant feedback loop. So that brings us to our next point. With specialization, you have increased communication channels and feedback loops. With silos, you don't. You have in and out. So with specialization, if a problem occurs, you watch it happen, you can address it. With silos, you send something over the fence, you don't find out until it's already down the channel that there's a problem, it's got to come back in, you have to learn what the problem is, regather information, and then solve that problem. If your eyes are open, and that's how we get to this head in a swivel in tunnel vision. I don't know how many of you are familiar with sports. Tunnel vision is that laser focus on the thing that's exactly in front of you. Head in a swivel doesn't change what your job is. It just means that you're surveying the field to make sure that you're taking in all the necessary information to do your job right. And then we have with silos, your teams are homogenous. Everybody's doing the same thing. With specialization, you have those diverse team roles within the same team so that everybody can rely on each other. So we're going to go through a really, really quick example. I'm going to keep it as very simple football as possible for those in the room who aren't very familiar with football. But we are going to talk about a part of football that is not as familiar to most people because you didn't bring me up here to tell you things you already know. So this is the offensive and defensive line. We're going to go through a quick situational play on the offensive and defensive line. This is the part of football where people just smash into each other over and over. That's my job. So this first person here, this is your quarterback. This is the person who's going to be getting the ball. This is the defensive line. That's me. We're the people that try to tackle that person when she has the ball. This is the offensive line. They're trying to keep us from tackling that person. Good? Good. So here's our setup. Here's what happens. At the snap of the ball, everybody's going to try to go get her. She gets the ball, everyone tries to go get her. Whee! And in doing so, this running lane shows up. This is our problem to solve. As a defensive lineman, this is what the issue is. She can run straight down here and get a whole bunch of extra yards, and that's a problem. So how do we address that problem? With silos, what happens is I don't care. I just keep doing my job running up the edge, and she keeps doing her job pushing around right here, and the running lane works, right? With poor specialization, not all specialization is done right. With poor specialization, you overcompensate. You try to do other people's jobs before your job is done. So if instead of ignoring it, I hop in here, instead, she can just bounce outside. And now she scored a touchdown because there's nobody out there, okay? Is that pretty clear to everybody? Great. So this is how you do it right. Instead of jumping into this lane, I wait until my job is done, and then I pursue the problem. And that forces her back inside. The defensive tackle makes the tackle, and the quarterback is sacked before she gets to the line of scrimmage. That's how you do specialization well. And here's the bottom line. Do your job until one of two things, and this is a really important point in football. Do your job until the job is done or the job changes. The job can change. It changes a lot. We have to be flexible. The key to knowing when the job is done or the job changes is education and communication. You can't be afraid to call for help. If the person around you is struggling, if they're drowning, they have to let you know. You still have to get your job done, but now you're aware. You have the information necessary to help them as best you can once your job is complete. Or if your manager tells you that your job has changed, but that communication has to be in place. And everybody has to be familiar with what their job is, what their responsibilities are. So exercises that kind of help drive this point home. First, roles within the organization. In football, we are constantly doing internal competitions. We have something that's called the Oklahoma drill. We have a few drills where pretty much you just get big people like me, and you just have us push each other around until somebody loses, over and over and over and over. So that can help you. You get people who do the same job and have them do that job at each other. You also build small teams that involve each one of those roles, and have those small teams compete against each other. Your offense competing against your defense competing against your defense, with a separate group of defined roles. So what this gives you is three things. One, everybody starts to understand specifically how each role depends on each other's role. Two, you start to learn when and where to ask for help. And three, you build bonds across roles, not just within them, and that's a big problem with siloization. One of the biggest problems we have is that I think in our industry, some people value some roles over others. What you do, you might feel is more important than what another person does. Developers might see operations teams in particular lights. Doing these exercises where you're actually doing some friendly competition allows you to start depending on each other and respecting each other's roles. Let's get to the next piece. We've got mission focus. This is one of my favorite quotes of all time. Very often misattributed to Vince Lombardi. In fact, my interview tie has this quote with a picture of Vince Lombardi on it. It's winning isn't everything, it is the only thing. This is a man who knew what his mission was. So the mission is very important. It provides a purpose for all levels and roles within the organization. It helps ensure that iterative goals are defined in support of that overall mission. And then it acts as a North Star. If people are working independently and you haven't clearly defined all the iterative goals along the way, it kind of gives them that North Star to be working towards, even when they don't have a specifically defined goal in front of them. If I'm playing on the field and I encounter a situation where I don't know what to do, I still know that I need to make sure I make this tackle before she gets into the end zone. That's my mission. Without it, individuals are actually incentivized to only meet personal and iterative goals. They don't have anything above that to be working for, so that's what they're incentivized to do. Silos build, which we already talked about that, and then morale can diminish because individuals don't feel like their work is important. You start to feel like the work you're doing, if it's not towards an overall goal, is busy work. And that's when morale starts to drop. The focus part is very important. You can define a mission, but if you can't get people to focus on it, there's no point. You need three things that people have to believe to be able to focus on your mission. They have to believe the mission is good. They have to actually believe in the mission itself. They have to believe the mission is possible. You don't just want to bang your head against a wall over and over. You'll give up very quickly. And three, they can impact the success of the mission. They have to believe that it has something to do with them and that they can affect that mission. Otherwise, what they're going to do is prioritize their goals or team goals, which do meet those criteria, ahead of the mission. And that's not what you want. That's how you end up with showboating wide receivers who got great stats, but their team never even makes a playoff season after season after season. So defining your missions and goals, you need to define who is affected. You need to define essentially the scope, the frame of reference. Is it for a time frame? Is it for the overall project? Is it for the task at hand? And then for each of those things, you need to define what success means. You need to know for an individual, for this task, this is what success is. For the team, for the overall project, this is what success is. You need all three of those things to have a clearly defined goal or mission. So I'm going to tell you a really quick story. I had a coach. It was his, I think, second season. It was my first season with him. And he had us come over. It was in the off season. And he lined up a row of cups of water. And he told us to come over, pick up the water, take a sip, put the cup back down. And he goes, "There, see? You believe in me. That could have been poison in that water." And we were like, "Why would you poison us?" And I just did what you told me. You're my coach, right? You just do what you're told. And then that same coach, throughout the course of the season, he had it in his head that the defensive line position wasn't actually really that important. So he would promote you, in his own terms, to linebacker. And if you didn't do well, he would demote you to the defensive line. So our defensive line was awful. We never got anything accomplished. And the whole rest of the defense is actually predicated on the defensive line. What you establish here affects how well everybody else is able to do their job. Ultimately, about 2 years ago, we got a coach who used to be, actually Coach LB, the guy in the picture, used to be a defensive lineman in the NFL, and the first thing he said to us was, "You are the most important position on the football field." And I truly believe that every single position coach should be telling their players that, because their players need to believe that without what you're doing, everything else will collapse. It doesn't mean that what everybody else is doing isn't just important. Every position coach should be telling their players that. and then everybody working together so that you can see how you fit in. The point being, bottom line, leadership is important, but only lemmings march off the cliff. If you don't respect that your top performing employees actually need to believe in a mission, they're going to stop following you. The mission must be relevant to each team member. The leadership must demonstrate to each team member that his or her role is critical to the success of the mission, or you just give up. If there's no point to me being here, why am I even going to work hard today? And then communication and inclusion. These people are smart people who are going to be making decisions on their own. You need to give them the respect and the information to be able to make those decisions in accordance with the mission as you would want them to make it. So the exercise, real quick, Team USA, my wife over here was on Team USA. She won a world championship as a center for Team USA. They had a unique challenge because it was the first Team USA, the first women's Team USA world championship. They had never seen anybody get that medal before. So what their coach did every single day was have them lay down and visualize what it felt like to have the gold medal be put around their neck and stand on that podium. They didn't lose a single game. In fact, no one scored on them the entire time. But what you can do, and I know it's one of those weird touchy-feely things, but we know that with software delivery, success is this kind of strange ethereal thing. It never ends, right? So you need to actually give people something to focus on to define what success means. Have them close their eyes and try to visualize what it feels like to do their job successfully. What that gives you is a way to actually focus on a thing. It's making it as tangible as possible. So overall, in closing, don't be afraid to encourage friendly and appropriate competition within the organization. It actually truly helps. It really, really does. Just make sure it's well-defined and friendly. Promote education, awareness, and ownership in order to achieve effective specialization, okay? This is, in my mind, one of the most important. Provide your team members with relevant, attainable goals and make them real. That's where the visualization comes in. That's as close as you're going to get to making a goal a tangible thing. And then work to ensure all team members recognize the value in their roles and others' roles as well. And that's my presentation. Thanks, everybody, for listening and for letting me talk about football. Oh, great. So, does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Can you give an example of where sharing knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want a football example or a?
Any example you can think of, whatever you're comfortable with.
So, in a football example, when you're at practice, there are very few times the defensive line can practice by themselves. So a lot of times you're going to need to use other people's specialized roles to understand exactly what it is you're going to be doing. So in training, you might have somebody who's a testing engineer, and then you might have somebody who's a developer. And if you can work them together so the developers are learning their craft, while the testing engineers are training against what the developers are doing, then both of you are bouncing off each other and learning. But you're still doing what you're specialized to do. You're just doing it in conjunction with each other rather than at each other.
We also just put some questions online up there, so.
Would it be wiser to declare a large mission or several smaller missions? So the way that I see it is that there is one main mission. Then you also have iterative goals towards that mission. Those iterative goals can be individual, they can be team-based, they can be situational. So you do want iterative goals along the way. You don't want one or the other. But those goals need to be defined in such a way that added all together, they're actually working you towards that overall mission. And do you have examples of friendly competition in DevOps teams? Absolutely, I do. Actually, we at Booz Allen right now are setting up an internal hackathon. So we are setting it up. We're using the team-based approach where we've got teams of 4, and they're going to be actually exercising DevOps. It's not about what product they build. It's about how well they take an application and DevOpsize it. And then we'll be judging them on those criteria. But it's all internal, 10 teams of 4, and then that way everybody is learning those skills with each other because they want to beat each other at it, which is the best way to get me to do something. Are these votes, or how do we get negative one?
Votes, yeah.
Are we using this polling system today? I don't know. I can't answer that question. What about working with other teams with different approaches? How do you bring people out of their silos that aren't on their team? So that's a really, really tricky question. That goes to the cultural as you move kind of up that chain, right? That's sort of your administrative culture. So that's on your leadership to make sure they're working with their co-leadership. You have it in these little pockets on the ground, and it's sort of like that example I gave you with my coach and then my defensive line coach. If at that level your management is not respecting each other the same way the individual roles need to respect each other, everything goes downhill. It's not going to work if at that level they're not respecting each other either.
Got a good question there.
What's the DevOps equivalent of an own goal? Not doing DevOps. I mean, I think we all know that there is an entire spectrum of ways that you can implement DevOps, right? There's no one ultimate, this is the DevOps solution. So an own goal would be, in my mind, trying so hard. I think it was, who had the presentation yesterday where it was, I think it was something about testing. Was it yesterday? I don't remember. Essentially, if you focus on the amount, you should be focusing, when it comes to automation, focus on the amount of resources it takes to do a task, not the overall impact of what that particular task is. If you instead focus on what the overall impact of that task is, you're actually spending more resources than you should be because you think you're attacking the bigger problem, when in reality, you're not attacking the bigger problem, which is your resources. So that to me is an own goal when you're like, I'm gonna do this thing, I'm gonna go after the right thing, but you're actually attacking the wrong problem and you shoot yourself in the foot. Where am I?
Just one more question.
As a shark. Oh, yes. How do you feel about our hometown heroes, the militia? Well, I don't feel anything about them anymore because they no longer exist. Who asked that question? The militia are now the Boston Renegade. They used to be owned, I forget the name of the owner, they used to be owned by somebody and he folded the team, so they're now the Boston Renegade. But yes, we did have quite a long-standing rivalry of sorts with the Boston militia. I have played in Doughboy Stadium many, many times. Any further questions? Great, thanks everybody.
All right, thank you, Katie. That was, I think, a really wonderful introduction. As I mentioned, the theme for today is really going to be about working with different teams, and a mission is a way to unify that. So I think it's really exciting that we've been able to kick off the day like this. Now we're actually going to talk to some people who might be on those teams that you may not be part of yourself, but you certainly work with probably every day. So our next speaker is going to be Vijaya Kokili. She's a QA manager at Commerce Hub in Albany. She's going to share some experience working with teams, actually not just QA teams, also DBA teams, IT teams. So these are teams that we just have to work with, particularly if we're in larger companies or in legacy systems. But we often find that there are barriers either imposed by that team or imposed just by siloization, the fact that there are separate teams like that. So I'm going to turn it over to Vijaya. Can you give her a huge round of applause?
Thank you, guys. Katie Rose, thank you. I'm going to touch upon kind of same points. The reason or the way this idea came to me on why I want to talk about operations challenges. Is everybody able to hear me? Yes? Okay, good. So last year was my first time at DevOps Boston, and I came with a bunch of colleagues from different departments, DBA, QA, operations, release team, IT. And then end of the conference, we went back, walking to the hotel, and it was like, where do we really fit into this DevOps role, right? Or DevOps culture, organization, where do we really fit? Where does QA fit? And we really did not hear anything about that in the last year's conference. And for me, I mean, that was a question for me too. I went back and I was very confused. I mean, does this really mean that QA doesn't really make sense in the DevOps culture? Does it mean that DBA doesn't make sense anymore? And going back to my workplace, and I'm from Commerce Hub, I'm the QA manager, and I'm looking at how we are introducing DevOps at our organization. We started DevOps culture like 2 years ago, and we are still evolving. We are still learning from what we have put in place and how to actually improve that process. So these are all my observations that I have seen at our workplace. And based on the open spaces talks that we had yesterday in this conference, many of them have the same kind of questions. Where do we really fit into this culture? And how are we supposed to start DevOps in our organization? So if you have any questions along the way, I don't want to wait until the last minute until I'm done, but you can definitely speak up, and if you have any questions, just ask along the way. So how do other roles really fit into this DevOps, right? We talked about microservices, cloud services, containers, and pods. And coming to this DevOps conference, we talk a lot about it. So and these are really focused more on the software engineers, both in the operations and in the actual application development. So how does really QA and DBA fit into this culture? So we talk about step 1, development, and then we talk about operations, which is a step 2. And I'm like, okay, can we please talk about QA and DBA? So taking a step back, I want to talk about how really DevOps evolved, not just at our organization, but in general in the other organizations. We take examples of Facebook, Google, and maybe IBM, and we talk about their culture, I mean, how they are actually frequently releasing their code every day, maybe multiple times a day. And it is so seamless. The customer on the other end doesn't have any kind of issues with the new features that are being introduced to them. So there is no downtime, basically. Really, how DevOps evolved is because of the frustration that came up from different teams. Frustration between teams, basically because of lack of communication. So teams, like Katie mentioned, the teams are so siloed, and they are so focused on what they are doing, and they're so used to the tools that they are using. But they're not aware of what the other teams are working on or what the other teams' tools are. So from a QA perspective, when we are working on a product or testing that product, it is like the development team is actually throwing the stuff over the wall, and then it is in QA/Q, and we are actually waiting until we can get to that, or basically gathering all the requirements, or we are waiting until the application is completely done. So that was the lack of communication between teams and lack of collaboration. Obviously, if you're using different tools in different teams, there is no collaboration, right? Because the other team is an expert at the tools that they are using, and you're an expert at the tool that you're using, and you have no idea about what the other tool does. And obviously, that is going to result in extra time and labor to deliver the product. And given current scenario or how our customers don't want to wait. And there are so many vendors out there who are constantly coming up with new features, new applications, and the customer is going to the vendor who is actually providing them the services like ASAP. So obviously, when we do that, there is more of maintenance that is involved with the software systems too, because we are doing everything at the end. So what exactly is DevOps, right? It's definitely not a methodology like waterfall, or it's definitely not a tool. No vendor here is going to tell you, okay, here is the tool, and use this tool is the perfect DevOps tool. Or it's not even a process. So if you really look into how the methodologies and processes evolved, it is really the customers who are driving us to get there. So initially, we did the waterfall model, and things were taking too long. Things are being thrown over the wall. They are sitting in one department, then going to the other department, then going to the other department. And there was so much time being taken in between those transitions. And then we said, okay, why don't we do agile methodology, right? And in agile methodology, we said, okay, we'll do things faster. But still, there was no collaboration happening. And then we said, okay, you know what? Why don't we introduce something called a Kanban process? Again, it's the same thing. It's the same teams. They are still siloed, but we are only naming it different. So what exactly is DevOps, and how do we really get to the success of introducing new features or software to our customers at the pace they wanted? So it is definitely a culture. I know Katie did that resemblance with the football game. I mean, I'm not aware of the football game, so I'm going to do that with the software. So it is definitely a culture. It is a mindset. You have to have a mission or a goal. And obviously, the technology delivery and how you're going to effectively collaborate with the other teams, that is important. Again, it is not a tool. You're not going to download some open source tool or a free trial software and say, yes, I'm following DevOps. That's not how it works. It is about breaking those barriers between the teams. It really encourages collaboration, communication, more accountability. So it is really not just the responsibility of an engineer to say, yes, my responsibility is to code this application and I'm done. It doesn't end there in the DevOps culture. It's actually taking right from the start to finish and beyond that. It is the responsibility of the team, the product team. It is no more called a development team or a QA team. It's a product team on the whole. And obviously, this is going to be resulting in faster deliveries that our customers are looking for. And continuous improvement. I think continuous improvement is not just a DevOps culture. I think it does apply to any facet of our life. Like you stumble on something, you look into how you actually wanted to improve that so that you don't run into the same thing. So that is what is continuous improvement, which DevOps encourages for. So what was the traditional operations? So IT infrastructure. So IT used to come, so in your company, an IT team will come and say, okay, this is what you're doing, and they publish it to the entire organization, and the rest of the organization follow it. I mean, they might not, the rest of the organization might not know what exactly they are doing or how it is actually benefiting the organization. We just do it because IT told us, right? Or there will be some new request which will be made to the operations team to execute that request. Think of it as releases. At least from where I come at Commerce Hub, we get the code that needs to be released like maybe a couple of hours before the release. I'm like, how can you really tell that you are actually prepared for that release? Even the operations team doesn't know what they are releasing, right? So this is how the traditional operations are. But with DevOps, the process is being more democratized and it is going to be more collaborative. So when we say communication also need to be increased, communication is always a key problem right from ages. I mean, any organization that I have picked so far, the first top one challenge that they have mentioned is communication. So how do we really improve that? I mean, we keep talking about improving, but it feels like we have never been improving those challenges. So how we started DevOps at Commerce Hub. So we had these siloed teams, like the project management team, the development team, the quality assurance, DBA, and operations support. And these teams were so siloed, they know what they want to do. So they come in, day out. They know, okay, here are my tasks, and I'm doing this, and I'm done for the day. And they were not aware of what the other teams were really using in terms of tools. Then we said, okay, let's introduce DevOps. It's so easy, right? So we said, okay, we picked one person from each department, put them together in a room, and say, that's the DevOps team. Really? That is how it works? And what we observed is that the teams were still siloed. So basically, we pulled all these different members from different teams, and we put them together in a room, and they were still not talking because they were still using their own tools, which are related to the siloed teams. So that really doesn't help. Putting the teams together is not a successful approach either. So there is a terminology I'm not sure if you are aware of. It's a matrix organization, right? So me as a functional manager, I'm the QA manager. So I handle the QA department. But how does it work when you're introducing DevOps? Do I have to quit my job? Or does the DBA manager quit their job? I mean, what is their role in this? So the functional managers, like the QA manager, DBA manager, or the IT manager, or the professional services or product management team, they are actually going to tell what needs to be worked on. So if you have a project, here are the 2 features that the team should be working on or focusing on. So they are prioritizing the work. And as a functional manager, I'm telling the teams on how that work can be done efficiently and what tools should be used. That way we have a proper standard across the organization. Sounds good? So far with me? Okay, good. So these are the challenges that I have observed while we were developing the DevOps culture at Commerce Hub. So ownership wars. So Katie mentioned about getting head-on head, right? Now, as a QA, I want to do my job because I know how to do my job efficiently. And then as a DBA, they know what they have to do. And every one of us, we feel like we know very well about how to make calls or decisions in the area that we are expert at. But in the DevOps culture, we are talking about this is what actually it feels like. When I was walking from the conference last year to the hotel, that is what my colleagues felt. They were like, it's so like they are being crushed in this DevOps culture. They don't have a say anymore about what they want to do or what they want to propose. They feel like they have to just do what's asked of. And that is not what the DevOps culture is about. So how many of you here are from the database team or QA? And how many of you feel that every time you try to propose something, you feel like you are being crushed and you are basically feel like, okay, you just have to do what's being asked of? Doesn't matter if you're in a QA or a DBA team either. Nobody? Okay, I'll take that everybody's lying here. And another challenge that we have seen is basically when you go to a DBA and ask, okay, this is what we want to do, you feel like you are always being said as like, no, we cannot do this. And that is, again, a culture change. You cannot keep saying no. And end of the day, your coworkers are going to feel like, you know what, these guys are not cooperating with us. And that is the impression you are basically giving to your coworkers. So how does this really, how do we change that culture, right? So you need to embrace the tools, and the tools are really not like siloed within the teams, like departments, but more across the departments. You need to understand what the other tools are. You need not have to be an expert at every tool that's being introduced and every team is using, but you need to at least understand, you need to ask the questions as to why. Don't say no. That is what it should be. And that is what the DevOps culture is about. And don't just include the operations team or IT team at the far end of your software development lifecycle. Try to include them in your daily activities as you're developing the software. That way they also understand how exactly, not how exactly, but why these tools are being introduced. If it's a new tool that, say, a software developer is recommending, there must be a reason for it, right? There should be a good reason. And who is really going to maintain that tool in the future? So try to ask those questions rather than saying, no, we cannot do it. And coming to the next challenge, it is all these app tool kind of generation, like, oh, I have an app for this, I have an app for this, and everybody has access to every app. And there is also open source, and anybody can just download those open source softwares and give it a try for 30 days. And guess where this has actually taken us? Every business person in the organization feels like they know everything. So the product owner comes and says, okay, you know what? Why don't we use this tool if we have this challenge? They're not thinking about, will that tool really fit the current software architecture, and what is the future of that tool? Those are the questions that need to be asked. So leverage those shared services concept. Again, it need not have to be a no when somebody says, we want to introduce this new tool. So just try to collaborate with the team and tell them what are the benefits of it. Don't just say, we already have a tool that probably is going to help, because that is something that we see at our organization. Everyone wants to work on new tools and shiny objects, right? They don't want to see what we have right now in our inventory of tools. So look into what our existing tools really do and try to see if what is that we are going to get from the new tools. And if possible, try to see if the new tools replace the existing tools. Don't just try to collect all these tools and end of the day you have like hundreds of tools to manage. So this is an example where we have different tools being used by different teams. So for the issue tracking, the development team and QA uses Jira, but operations team, they use Salesforce. So definitely there is no visibility between what's going on between the teams. And same thing for the version control repository, Dev and QA uses ClearCase, but operations team, we used to just put the jar files in a shared folder, right? Awesome tool. And same thing with monitoring. We don't have any monitoring in development and QA environments, but then operations have something. I'm like, who really knows all this? I mean, if I'm writing a software, I'm programming a software, I want to release it, I want to understand how that is being used or how that is being deployed in production, right? And what are the tools that are being used? If the operations team comes back to me and says, here is an alert that we saw, and I'm like, how did you get that alert? We did not have any kind of monitoring, so you had something. So why don't we try to introduce that across the environments, right? And another big thing, cloud. We have been talking so much about cloud services, right? And I have been talking to a couple of guys yesterday from GE, and they have the legacy system. And so do we. We have a huge monolithic application, and at the same time, that is bread and butter for us. So how do we really get the DevOps, like continuous delivery kind of thing for that legacy application? So it is definitely a cloud era. We wanted to go to cloud, and we need to learn before we go too fast and say all our applications can be on the cloud. And when we are talking about cloud, I'll give you a scenario. What's happening right now for us is we are building new features and new components for the existing legacy or monolithic application. And the new features are now in the cloud, and the legacy application is still on site. It's doing great. But when we are introducing the tools, like say the monitoring tools or anything, we have to really marry these tools with the legacy and also the latest features or components that we are introducing. So how do you really use those tools to fit these needs? You have to become a matchmaker. Really, you need to really think about how these microservices and the legacy application jive with the tools that we are introducing. It is not just thinking about the new services that we introduced. It's everything. The next challenge is testing. So this is where the challenge comes for software testers. The testers, our customers are basically asking us to get the features fast. Maybe they are just giving us a week time. And for us, we don't have the time to say, okay, let's do this development and then let's assign like 2 weeks of testing and then let's do a release testing and then release it. We don't have that much time. So how do we really change all these? Given that we are actually building so many microservices, think of it from a contract testing point of view, right? So there are multiple product teams in an organization, and each product team is in charge of the module that they are working on. And you also need to be aware of how those modules will impact the other modules that the other product teams in your organization are working on. So try to create those testing scenarios in such a way that you need not have to really deploy everything for your application, but just deploy your module and try to create like mock services and try to talk to the other product teams and get what their requirements are for their modules. So if the other team's module is expecting, say, XYZ as their values, so our module should be able to get those values to the other module of the other product team. So that is what is the contract testing. And microservices testing, the traditional software testing was functional testing. Basically, the QA engineers were waiting until the entire application is developed. You have a UI, you have requirements, everything is developed, then QA is ready for testing. Doesn't work that way anymore. It's really focusing on how the components are being built. If you have 10 microservices that you're going to introduce as part of creating an application, and as each microservice is being built, try to test them by themselves. Don't wait until all those 10 microservices are built. And then behavior-driven development. The traditional tools that software testing teams had were really focused on functional. Basically, you have to wait until everything is done and programmed and developed and hand it off to QA. But you need not have to do that anymore. Yesterday, Jennifer Davis mentioned about documentation, right? So the moment you document something, it's going to be outdated the next day, right? So how do you overcome those kind of things? And those are all continuous process improvements that you want to think about in this DevOps culture. And behavior-driven development is one good thing that we are actually trying out at Commerce Hub. So Cucumber is one of the example. So that is the testing tool too. You need not have to have separate test plans for software testing team. You need not have to have like requirements document which are separate for the project management team. You can actually combine those two and put it into a English like a human readable language in Cucumber, and those are actually our automation tests. That way, if the requirements are changing, say a customer came and say, okay, we don't want to do this anymore, and the development team has changed those, and obviously it's going to fail on the requirements, and which is nothing but our automation scripts. So you do not have to have different teams talking different languages. Obviously, the project management team is not going to understand the coding, say Java programming. You can't expect them to come and read that code. So the behavior-driven development is going to help with that. And challenge number 5, time and budget constraints. With so many technologies coming, and we wanted to use those technologies for our new features, there needs to be massive training that needs to happen, right? And there should be a lot of hiring that needs to happen. And those skills, I mean, the organization also need to be aware that when we are going towards a particular vision for our company or the software, we need to get the talent too. We just cannot ask our current existing team to function without giving them any training or trying to add more headcount. And it's also going to be challenging from a finance perspective, where initially we had everything here on site, on premises. Now it is not that case anymore. Everything is in cloud. So how do you go to your CFO and say, you know what, this is how it's going, this is what we wanted to pay for this one, and it's probably going to change month by month. So that is a challenge too from a finance perspective. So I feel that the IT budgets definitely need to be restructured, and it cannot be just one person controlling that finance and budget. The other one is global teams. Many of the organizations, or I should say mid-sized to large organizations, they have like overseas teams, right? So we have our QA team in other side of the world, and there are a few other organizations where there are a few team members like developers working in some other countries. And how do we really get that into this DevOps culture? For me, DevOps culture is really about all the team members being at one location. It doesn't matter if they are on the other side of the world or here, but if the team is co-located in one place, it's going to be more efficient. Obviously, with the time zone communication, and there is lack of understanding of priorities when you're actually communicating on the other side of the world. So really, the question that I have is, does really DevOps culture apply when we have teams across all different countries? So a few of the solutions that we have tried, it's basically make sure that all the steps that you deliver for software are automated in your continuous delivery. There is no reason to do a release in in a QA environment in one way and do it in a production or live environment in a different way. So there is no reason for that. So just automate, make it one process, and that way you're also testing the release process across all the environments. And test every change, not just data change, but also configuration changes. So we talked about chef cookbooks and recipes. You also need to test those to make sure that they are doing what they are supposed to be, and if the application is changing, how are the cookbooks or recipes actually reacting to those? So that is another testing. Even for monitoring, try to monitor your dev and QA environments. Try to test those. Are they doing what they are supposed to? If an application is down, is my monitoring tool alerting? So try to test those in all environments. Don't just focus on saying live environment is what is more important. Every environment is important from my perspective. So always have a stage environment. So this is beneficial basically to say your stage environment should always have the latest version of what we have built in-house. And your production or live environment is what our customers are using. So if some customer asks for a feature, you should be able to just release it right from the stage to the live environment. And deploy frequently. One thing that we have implemented is applying like on and off switches in our code. So if a developer is developing something, try to encourage them to actually develop in a way that if something goes wrong, it should be less than a second for us to just turn off that feature, right? So do that, and every time you have a release, if it is a major release, try to do like a canary deployment. Use that feature only to introduce to limited number of customers, see how it does in the live environment, and then expand to the rest of the customers. The other one is if you have any kind of SQL commits in your version control tools, try to add some alerts so that the SQL database team is actually familiar with what changes are coming their way, rather than having to wait until the end of the project. A few things that I have mentioned here is about monitoring tools, infrastructure automation, tools to produce hardware, and CI builds. These are all like really good for our automation for the continuous delivery and also fast deliveries. So basically leave the past and don't just be in your mindset or in your team and tools kind of mindset. Try to get out of it. Try to know what the other teams are actually doing it, or part of your team members are doing, what they are using. So operations teams need to change with the changing philosophies. Obviously, the philosophy that we are talking about is do it fast and there is no wait time in between. And the concept of no DBA, most of the engineering teams, they feel like it's taking too long in the database team, so they are moving towards NoSQL. That way they can cut off the operations from a database perspective. So try to learn those NoSQL and see how we can actually get those benefits. For me, DBAs are still needed in a company because they are experts at data governance and maintenance. So no matter what we are doing with a SQL or a NoSQL, we still need the data management. And these are some metrics that were gathered in the State of DevOps report in 2015. Based on these responses from 20,000 tech companies, you can see how the DevOps culture actually increased the number of releases that we are doing and how fast we are doing those deliveries and how efficiently we are able to fix things rather than having to wait for several days or weeks. So these are the reports that were gathered. And another thing, if you want to introduce a DevOps organization or culture at your organization, it, it really doesn't work if it's coming from a C-level. It has to be really the teams saying, yes, we want to do it. So if somebody comes and says, okay, I'm going to plug few members from these teams and put together, that's really not going to work. And the key is obviously culture, process, and technologies. And keep reading the new technologies that are coming out. Try to know them. Try to get yourself familiarized with what are the advantages of it. Why do we really need those new tools? And don't be afraid to volunteer when new technologies are being introduced. Final note, Commerce Hub. We are located in Albany, New York. We are hiring, so if anybody is interested, want to know more about Commerce Hub, we are here. And that's it.
Sorry, forgot to turn the microphone on. All right, thank you, Vijay, for the presentation. We actually are going to switch over to taking a quick break. We're almost halfway through the set of speakers for the day, and then we'll go into open spaces. So there's more food out there. Please stand up, stretch your legs, get something to drink, and we'll see you back here in about 5 to 10 minutes, okay?
Good job.
Oh, thank you. I thought I wouldn't be able to talk for 30 minutes, but then I ran over the time. Yeah. David actually. Oh, thank you.
We're going to wait. We had some issues. I
Awesome.
mentioned
Okay,
people really
that's
didn't like that you could do down votes on
Email support.
yeah. So it's fine, but I want to at least explain don't vote things down. Like that's just bad.
Grab the mic. Yeah, don't be an asshole. Like, I wish I
I thought it was a token.
Like we can see that you wrote it down too. Like what do you expect us to do about it?
Right. I'm gonna shit on somebody else's cause. Publicly. While hiding behind my computer. Right, yeah, exactly. Like, let me passive aggressively, shout them down.
I will activate Pete's Q&A just so it's ready for whenever. I think he's going to have time for some questions because his is a shorter talk. Cool.
Find out.
This was a very,
Is that the universal laptop of the top?
Oh, you can use your own, but if you're going to, you're going to want to do an A/B test. So just like see if the display port works for you.
Okay,
Great. We're gonna start with Pete.
Oh,
No. So I'm going to present next. So you do your test, and then I'll just leave my laptop.
okay.
Okay, so we are definitely too soon for talks on this one. As for organizing, I'd say drop me an email. We don't do volunteers until typically like the last month before the
Various
event because
crap.
we don't know exactly what volunteer tasks there will be. If you're interested in longer term organizing, we'll probably get together in a few months to talk about how this went and whether we want to do it longer term. Send it to the organizer's email, and that way we all get your email. So no matter who ends up
So
taking
if
it up
Thunderbolt
next
port
year,
that
you'll
you
know
use,
to reach
I'll
out to
find out.
it's on the website. It's like organizers-boston-2015.
Hopefully we have love. There we go. And if I go to play, enough.
Awesome.
All right.
Nice.
Yeah, okay. Looks like
Should be good to go.
it's nice when we all just bring Macs
Great.
instead of the various iterations of Windows.
Great.
Although I have to give credit to 10. Sorry about that. They've minus the privacy patch that I had to stick on there, third-party privacy patch that I had to get on GitHub. Windows 10 is surprisingly as good as 7.
Exactly glowing regard, but
I told all my friends that there was no need to upgrade to 8 or 8.1. There were basically 6 registry tweaks you could do that make it as secure as your Windows 7 box to make it as secure as Windows 8. And I'm like, do that, install that Emmet tool that they have, and
it's the Windows model, right? So like every other release is a good one.
Yep, yeah. 8 was Windows Vista 2.0 or Windows 98 version 3.0, depending upon how far you want to go back.
Great. Then
cool.
Turn on it in the mic. Flip and then talk.
Test.
We're all looking to be higher.
Test.
I think probably a little bit higher. Seemed a bit quiet still.
Test.
There we go. That's good.
We're going to start you just a few minutes later. We're going to give people a full break. We'll just push the schedule back.
No problem. I was like, as I'm stuck in the tunnel in my Uber, I'm like, fuck, can you late? Oh god.
Oh, you're trying out the pointer?
Mm-hmm.
You know it has a laser pointer on it.
I don't ever use laser. This is the best speaker swag I've ever received because this is that thing that I'm like, I really need to buy one of these.
Yeah.
Ends up being a small world. So I just started 3 weeks ago. I have traveled back and forth to.
Yeah, no, I got that when I started doing talks. It's like, as a developer, we actually give a lot of talks. It was nice to have one like that. I was so impressed with that. That was my first thought about
But I'm brand new there. I'm a DevOps engineer. But very much serving that sort of. Yeah, I mean, I happen to not believe in the job title at all. Yeah, I think it's sort of pattern to assign a job title office. And you really. Yeah, exactly. And I don't really like the idea of leveraging, DevOps as a job title because you're still hiring for specific skills. No, so sometimes what people mean is they need an automation engineer. Sometimes what they mean is they need a systems engineer who can be embedded where they develop.
The way that you compose recipes. Now,
Right, exactly.
it generates put into food that will then create the recipes.
Yeah, from a delivery perspective. Yeah.
So when you use a rest message like Windows, like
Yeah, so in my role, how it's changing up.
create or like recommend
Software delivery code from
Your service discovery layer.
like, well, we have variables in there for
entire software pipeline to test
There's all those things like
implementing some of those things. First time in a long time I'm working on it. None of the real have actual change management process. Like a whole ITIL process.
Okay, folks, go ahead and take your seats. We're a little bit behind schedule, so we want to try and catch up. So go sit down, be quiet, and we'll get started in just a moment.
Sit down, be quiet.
Hands up, mouth shut. Crisscross applesauce.
Okay, so we're going to kick off our next set of talks now. It's going to be Pete Lum is giving a talk on managing network configuration with Git. As a data center architect at Cumulus Networks, and they have a Linux distro that runs on bare metal switches, so really a networking-focused company. He himself spent 5 years as a senior support engineer at Cisco, and kind of the goal of this talk is to show how far networking is behind in a more specific way, talking about specific network tools, how they might be replaced in the future. So I'll turn it over to you, Pete.
Thank you.
Round of applause, please.
Thank you. So I like to believe I'm the bravest speaker here because not only am I a network engineer, we're in a room full of DevOps people, so I'm probably the #1 or #2 most hated person in your organization behind, DBA, security, network. They're all kind of at the bottom. But I'm also going to teach a room full of people who know how to use Git. So got 2 things going for me. My first draft of this presentation was like 30, 40, 50 slides for 20 minutes because it turns out that networking sucks really bad, and that's why you hate your network team. And so I was like, how do I synthesize how bad networking is? And you can't. So I'm going to try. So a little bit about me. Part of this was my introduction. I've been in the networking industry for about 10 years. I'm a double CCIE, CCDE. I spent 5 years at Cisco as the senior support engineer for routing, working on service provider backbones, large data centers, things like that. And today I design, build data center networks for some of our largest customers at Cumulus. But more importantly, what my background isn't. I am not a programmer. I'm a network engineer. I am not a sysadmin. I'm a network engineer. Perl has 4 letters. So does Ruby. Sorry, chef. Python's okay. I can hit it with a stick enough times and it does what I want it to do. So what I'm trying to say with regards to Git is I have no idea what I'm doing. So again, I'm going to teach a room full of people who know how to use Git, right? So it's a text file repository, right? I mean, we store code in it, but really code is text, right? So why not just treat it as a text file repository, right? It's automatically going to give me file change management. I'm going to see who made those changes. I'm going to get to manage, timestamp those. Most importantly, I can use blame, right? It's built for teams to work on the same files, right? So if I have a team of network engineers, or if I'm really starting to break down silos and I'm working between DevOps and networking, right? I can have multiple teams looking at the same configuration files, looking at configuration differences and pushing changes, right? And it's really easy to get started. I don't know what I'm doing and I can use Git. But if you do know what you're doing, as a lot of people here probably are aware, there's a ton of knobs. So you can do super cool things that I don't understand. So You first have a remote repository, github.com, right, where everything lives. You copy that locally, so you can then break things and not let anybody know. You can create branches, right, for those new features, for those risky changes. And then I can merge that branch back into master, right, back into my mainline production code. So I can start thinking about these same concepts that I've been doing in code for network configuration, right? I can create master, I can create a new feature branch called IPv6 as I start to roll out IPv6 in my data center. And please, I really hope IPv6 is already in your data center. And for all of you that aren't thinking about it, I don't think you understand how much trouble you're in. So I can create a new branch called IPv6 and make all my changes. And there's some risk involved. So I put it in a new branch. I can then use an opportunity to merge that branch in, back into master, back into my base configuration, right? This becomes an opportunity to do a code review, right? Why can't I review network configurations the same way I would do a code review, right? Creating IPv6 addresses is not rocket science. I can give that to an intern. I can give that to an entry-level person, right? I can throw somebody a bone and have them do it, but I might not want to apply their changes directly to my network. I have an opportunity to bring in my senior network team, take a look at that and do a code review. Why did you do filters like this? Why did you use this subnetting? It's exactly the same concepts, right? And so let's take it a step further, right? I make that change, I merge it in, and things go really bad. So git revert, right? Again, it's the same concept because we're just talking about managing text files. I can then use fork, right? I can fork my project, use my baseline configuration for my East Coast data center, and use that to start building out new unique configurations for my West Coast data center so I'm not starting from scratch. You know, these things aren't rocket science, but networking is so far behind, we don't understand what wheels are, let alone talk about rockets. So Git is great at revision control and version control, right? This is something that's, again, really important, even for network people, but we do it in terrible ways, right? But the existing tools for networking suck. So Rancid is what most people use, which is basically a tool that SSHs or telnets, because telnet is still super common, into your box, copies the file off, and then just runs diff. That's cool, it's open source, basically everybody uses it. Or you can go spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to go give some network monitoring company your money, and they do the same thing and put it in like an HTML5 front end. So the downside though, this first implies a push method, right? So I have this configuration, I've created it, I've committed it to Git, how do I get it on my box? So that's the first problem, how do I manage that? What happens if I go onto the box and make changes in real time? How do I pull those back? On things like Cumulus, where I work, right, we make a Linux distro, right? It's not Linux-like, it is Linux. It looks like a 32-port Linux server, right? I can then just apt-get install Git onto my switch, make the changes, and then Git push my changes back upstream directly from the network device, right? The deployment can be challenging because of that, though, right? So Git manages code. It doesn't push things, right? This is why you use build systems and have lots of other tools in your environment, right? So Git is really one piece of that puzzle. You have to tie that together with Ansible or Puppet or Chef, and you have to have organizational behavior changes. Because if you have one or two people using Git and being good citizens, and then somebody comes in and makes a bunch of config changes on the box and doesn't push them back upstream, bad things happen. But again, how is that any different from code, right? If you're pushing code into production that you didn't commit, you should be hit with a stick. That's the same thing in networking. So the really awful things, and this is part of why your network team is so curmudgeonly. One, most vendors suck at rollback. So I apply an IP address with the command IP address. I remove an IP address with the command no IP address. So that means I can't just remove the line from the file and have it go away. I have to put a different line in that file to revert my change. That's when it's okay. It gets way worse than that. I can have little typos cause catastrophic failures. ISIS is a routing protocol, who really cares? I can put it on an interface and say on ETH0, I want to run this routing protocol, whether or not, right? So this removes the routing protocol from that specific interface. No IP router ISIS. If I'm under the interface and I say no router ISIS, I just removed that process from the whole box and just brought all of my networking down. Whoops. So again, there are existing challenges that make this an imperfect system. Vendors are moving in the right direction. Please give me your money and I will tell you how we can do it at Cumulus and make your life easier. So really, this is it. Right? This is what we're looking at. This is what we're talking about. Right? I have network configuration. You can see where I've made changes. Right? I've added IPv6. It's just code. It's just configuration. Right? It's just infrastructure. So I was going to have a demo, but due to technical problems, I'm going to show you some boring stuff instead of showing you a live demo. But you can take all of my stuff off of Git and put it in VMs that you can get for free and recreate this. So, sorta. But really, all we're talking about, right, when we're talking about Git, when we're talking about managing network configurations, is they're just text files, right? So I have my data center. I have each of the nodes in my data center as a file, as an object, right? I can look at the configuration from a Cisco device, right? It's just another text file, right? I push this file out to the box and make my changes, right? I'm gonna push that with Ansible, with a bash script, by hand, you know, make little interns do it, whatever. You know, there's nothing here that's rocket science. You know, again, I get the history that Git gives me for that configuration, right? When did I add BGP? When did I add IPv6? When did I break everything with an incorrect route filter and then have to roll that route filter back and revert my changes, right? This is what I showed on the slide, right? This is my change to add IPv6, right? You can see the commit across the network for every device that got touched to make that change. I can see my route filter that I added that broke everything, and then I had to roll it back. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that being a network engineer is hard, not because, because of the technical piece, but also because the tools that I have to use as a network engineer are stuck in the Stone Age. I basically work on mainframes, right? I don't get AWS. I can't just swipe a credit card, right? You guys don't even understand. I have to walk uphill multiple miles both ways to work every day. And so, but my points, the takeaways, right, is that Git can resolve a lot of problems that I have, but not all of them, right? My network vendors need to be turned upside down, shaken really good, or at least threatened with money, moving it from one vendor to another to get the tools that we need, right? What is the power of Linux? It's the power of separating configuration from state. That I have Etsy network interfaces as a file, and then I have the interface information as state in the kernel, right? That's why Ansible and Puppet and Chef can do what they do. I need this in the network. Go and beat up your vendors and make them give this to you, right? And again, as you know, we're at a DevOps conference, right? Culture is key. New tools require new ways of thinking, requires new ways to operate. And your network engineers are only going to be slightly better or worse than your DBAs at moving into the future, right? So NetOps, as the 4 people on the planet that actually do this call it, like DevOps, requires that cultural shift. You have to get buy-in. If you have a team of 4 and only one person is using Git, it's not going to help you anyway. That's all I have. Time for questions? Do we need to go?
You got time for one question.
Given that vendors have been historically infamous for providing the tools that you just described, I don't know how much you're into software-defined networking.
Sure.
But it seems to me, and full disclosure, I'm involved. To me, that's our opportunity. Well, you guys want us to play in your proprietary world and have capabilities in the dollars a year reinforcing proprietary CLI. Why should you change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're going to write a new spec that will actually.
So the comment on the floor, I'll try to summarize so everybody can hear, right, is there's a shift with software-defined networking, right? And in using that as that opportunity to kind of put those vendors over the barrel, right, and make them deliver the features you want. Because the challenge is that you might have 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 switches, and then you look at State Street and they have like 600, and it turns out Cisco doesn't care, right? Like you're not going to drive that change. But what the gentleman's bringing up is, with software-defined networking, with these new things, with open networking user groups, with things like Cumulus, with things like Open Daylight, some of these open source projects that are coming, this is that opportunity to say, look, there is an alternative tool, right? Networking today is where Linux was 10 or 15 years ago. We are that far behind, and just as that has pushed Microsoft forward, and I mean, we can hate on Microsoft all we want, they've made huge improvements over what life used to be like for Microsoft. Why? Because there's competition, because there's Linux. This is that opportunity, as the gentleman's saying, this is that opportunity to say, look, if you don't give me what I want, I will go to another vendor, I will use an open source solution. There are other options finally in town, right? Again, I work on a mainframe. It's, again, moving from the days of mainframes to x86. It's that exact same kind of shift today. If you have other questions, please find me. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Pete. Okay, next up is Ed Ray. Ed, you want to come up? Oh, there you are. Okay, so meanwhile, I'll just say what's going to be happening after this. We have our lunch break. We'll probably start a few minutes later, so a little bit closer to noon. It's going to be right out there, same as last time. Feel free to go disperse, hang out. And then you have about an hour. We'll come back for one more talk, and then we'll do an open spaces discussion. Again, we're going to slightly change up the format from yesterday, so make sure to show up for the initial discussion where you're going to vote on topics again.
There we go. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Okay, so I will turn it over to Ed. Can you all give him a big round of applause?
I feel a little bit out of my element here. I'm a security person. I'm the guy that breaks into your stuff and tells you what's wrong with it, which means I probably earn the ire of most developers in here. But hopefully what I can provide here will give you some ideas and even some ways that you might be able to help me. I think the tendency in the security community is to sort of look at DevOps in that sort of fashion, that, you know, security people are known to love process. We like to have process and procedure, and I'll give you an example. The FedRAMP compliance metrics has 1,500 controls in it. 1,500. That's kind of embarrassing, to be quite honest with you, that they have to be able to do that in order to secure their networks, but they're the federal government, they can do that. So a quick overview of DevOps. This is more for my peace of mind than for yours. I'm assuming that people will more or less agree with the things that are on this slide. The quote, DevOps is an emerging, geez, this thing keeps going real quick. DevOps is an emerging set of principles, methods, and practices for communication, collaboration, and integration between software development and IT operations. Hopefully that is a definition that everyone here agrees with, and that I can move on kind of to the next slide and sort of identify the problem. In the security realm, we like to slow things down. We like to be able to make sure that everything is de-risked and working properly. That's not the DevOps world. I'm going to try to get out of this here. The challenge is that cycle times are getting slower, and security people need to realize, as I have, because I come from more of a hardware development background, that security needs to grow up and be able to adapt to changing times and be able to work with developers in trying to make their software as secure as possible as they roll it out, and as they make changes to it, to be able to roll with those changes and help them keep their stuff secure. Problem, at least more problems. I don't think that in most cases manual testing is going to work anymore. It depends on how much code you have to write, and security people have a tendency to go overboard. I'll give you an example. Probably 7 or 8 years ago, I was doing consulting for a defense contractor, and a zero-day exploit came out. And a friend of mine at Microsoft and I looked at it and go, oh, this is simple. This is a registry key change. We can push this out as a GPO. So we went and looked at it. I made the recommendation to the folks at this particular contractor. They stuck it in their domain-wide group policy, pushed it out, boom, it was done. And I think a month later, Microsoft pushed out a fix, which was essentially that. Fast forward 3 to 6 months later, and some auditor comes in and says, no, that's not the way you should do it. We need you to roll that back and go through a step-by-step procedure on implementing this. And we're like, it was one line of code. It was a registry key change. So, security people have, like I said, this impression and tendency to want to implement process and everything when sometimes it really isn't necessary. The solution is the DevOps way, which is to try to automate as much as possible. The software testing, the operational infrastructure. I heard the gentleman that was here previous to me. Mainframes are going to be the Achilles heel. I come from a cloud security company, and I came from an enterprise security background. We tended to look at mainframes as like the bastard children of the IT infrastructure, and we kind of shoved them off to the side and prayed that no one connected them up to the main network. Well, just like with SCADA networks, people are connecting mainframes up and probably have been for a long time, and lo and behold, there's loads of security problems with them that need fixing, and a lot of people are not up to the task, but I think that that's one of the last great challenges to cloud infrastructure being accepted by large enterprises is what to do with mainframes. We'll figure it out, and I'm sure there's a lot of people working on it, and I probably maybe end up being one of them, at least in terms of an architecture perspective. So we want to automate things into an agile state by securing infrastructure, apps, and code. I'm going to start out with code because and I pulled this slide from a RSA conference earlier this year. I don't know if I agree with those numbers. I don't know where they pulled those, the 4 billion, 5 billion, but that's probably a rough percentage of where spending is. We spend a buttload of money on network and host security. We try to train people, but they still click on email. So that I don't know how useful that is sometimes. We do encrypt data, but bright bulbs like to stick the keys for their encryption on the same server. I went into an organization that had stuck the keys for encrypting their database server information on the same server as their database. So when the hackers compromised the network, they were very smart. They stayed in there for 6 months, waited for all of the updates and backups to go through so that they were able to have control of all of them. Then they put their keys in, encrypted everything with their stuff, and said, pay up. And I was called in after the fact, and I looked at the situation, and I said, you have any backups? They said, no, they encrypted them all. I said, how much are they asking for? It was mid-7 figures. I said, how important is that data? Do you have it anywhere else? No. Write the check. I mean, there is no, at that point, you just basically have to admit defeat. And hackers, for the most part, are after money. They're not really after, damaging your reputation. Some people are, but by and large, they're after money, like the Ashley Madison folks. Is anyone familiar with what happened to Ashley Madison this summer? Okay, so I don't need to repeat myself. Their CEO just got fired at the end of August. So shorter timeline than Target. It took Target about 9 months to fire their CEO. It only took Ashley Madison about 6 weeks. So, but at the end of the day, a lot of, I don't know if 90%, some people that's going to vary, but I would say the vast majority of people reuse code. I'm a hacker. I'm lazy. I would rather use somebody else's code if they've done it better than me. I love PowerShell scripts for that reason, because they're, as much as they are an infrastructure's best friend, they're also a hacker's best friend. I'll go grab an exploit from somebody if I'm looking to do a successful pen test, but I'll follow that up with some custom PowerShell script that I've come up with, assuming it's a Windows environment, which I'm assuming in most organizations it is, or at least to a certain extent it is. So, people don't spend a whole lot of money on software security. I think I might want to retitle this slide. This gives the impression that developers are the problem. When I've come into organizations, I've usually found that developers are smart enough to know where the issues are and how to mitigate their own risks. This is more of a slide that you might want to show to management that says, hey, I'm doing this, these are the things I'm doing, and these are the things that we should be doing, in case that you do have some software developers that just sort of roll crap out. I'm sorry for using the word crap, but occasionally that is what you do roll out on occasion. So, but there is plenty of open source stuff out there. The Gauntlet site. Here, I'll pull up actually a site which is everyone familiar here with the Open Web Application Security Project? Man, can I get? Yeah. Anyway, are people here familiar with the Open Web Application Security Project? OWASP.org. Anyone here? Okay. Well, I'll explain. It's a organization that is devoted to open source solutions to web application security issues. They publish something called the OWASP Top 10. It's what they consider the top 10 web application security vulnerabilities. SQL injections in there, cross-site scripting. If you can show to your management that you have mitigated the risks in those areas, that goes a long way in convincing them and organizations that might come to you after the fact that you've been hacked, that you've done your due diligence. Cherry picking what you look at is basically trying to, you don't want to be the lowest hanging fruit on the tree. Pick off the things like the OWASP Top 10 and make sure that your apps are secure from those things. When you have code changes, those are the times when you red flag them for review. Hopefully you have an automated process in place that you can utilize to check that code. If you don't, sometimes you might have to do that manually. That's going to be a judgment call on your organization's part. This is easier said than done. I've seen my share of false positives, and the sad thing is one false positive does roughly equivalent to close to 100 valid bugs, and it can be a pain in the butt when you've identified something that turns out not to be something. But hopefully that's where you can stick to more differential analysis and automation, where you can minimize the risk of that happening. Quiet is better than wrong. It goes back to something I said a few minutes ago. Developers, for me, when I go into organizations, I want to find out what they're doing and be able to promote them to management, who are ultimately the people that end up hiring me as a trusted advisor. Whether it's in the development realm or in the network realm, most of them know what the issues are, and they've probably communicated them up the chain. They've just not gotten the kind of airplay that they need to. So, for me, as well as for security people in general, who hopefully some are in the room, but I try to aspire to, not giving them, requirements that they have to do, rather ask them questions and, suggest requirements and not try to tell them what to do. This is an example of an AppSec pipeline that I helped put together for an organization. It may look unwielding, but a lot of the steps, especially the ones in the middle, may or may not need to be repeated or used based upon how big your app is and what it does. Are people here familiar with what happened to Chrysler this summer? Yeah, the bright bulbs at Chrysler decided to do some software implementation in their cars, which probably the way things are going, and it probably was a great idea. Unfortunately, they didn't do a whole lot of software testing, and what they found is that it was rather easy for hackers to break into cars and crash vehicles. There was a talk about Black Hat about it. Chrysler had to recall 1.5 million cars and pay a 9-figure FTC fine. And to top it all off, they decided that it would be a really great idea to push out the fix as a USB stick to 1.5 million users via mail. As a pen tester, that's kind of like 101 when I go and do social engineering. I will find out, I'll either throw USB sticks in a parking lot, or I'll specifically target some particular individual and mail them one. I mean, you just do not do that. But anyway, Chrysler could have utilized this pipeline, and I think probably solved a lot of their problems. Maybe not all of them, but at least been able to when the FTC or other people, regulators came and said, well, how did this happen? They can go, well, this is our AppSec pipeline. This is how we implemented things and de-risked things. Yet it still happened. They can at least, they would have probably gotten rid of the fine. They probably wouldn't have gotten rid of the recall, but at least they would have shown that they had de-risked their application from crashing cars into walls or having the brakes fail. This sort of the key features of that AppSec pipeline from the prior slide. It's designed for iterative improvement, reusable path for AppSec activities to follow, a consistent process. It relies heavily on automation. Everything in there was implemented via APIs so that if you needed to push something via Veracode, into Veracode, you could do it without saving the file, emailing it, or whatever the medium was for you to get it to Veracode. There was an automated process by which it was done so that they could do their static analysis and then feed it back to you. If you need to grow it, in terms of having even more points to be able to test your code, it was flexible enough to do that, and I found that it gracefully interconnected with the development process. These are some more goals of that AppSec pipeline, trying to automate things and increase visibility of metrics, flow through the system, tracking of work status, et cetera, et cetera. This is a quick little slide on the breaking down how the pipeline works. Bag of Holding is a open source tool that's available that allows you to prioritize your applications for testing so that you're not reinventing the wheel, so to speak. Hopefully, are my compadres here from Rackspace? There they are. They are my DevOps people. I am not a DevOps person, although I aspire to be. If you really need help with some of the more nitty-gritty details, you don't know what Bag of Holding is or some other thing on here, please stop by our, I guess it's kind of a table. We don't officially have a booth here. But John Yee and R.D. Douglas are floating around, and they'll be happy to answer your DevOps questions. And if there's anything that was unclear during my security talk, feel free to ask me as well. This is the middle, which is the part that I'm most familiar with, doing static and dynamic code testing using, we picked these four suite of tools for this. You may be different. You may not need all of them depending upon how big your app is and how critical it is. If all it's doing is finding the best restaurants in Boston, don't really think you need to probably go to IBM and Veracode, and spend all that money. But if you're, designing it to, control the rods in a nuclear power plant or, cars brakes, you might want to do a little bit more testing before you roll it out. These activities, they don't need to be run, they could be run concurrently so that you can, test stuff out, in one while you're testing one out in another. This is the end where ThreadFix is another open source tool that allows you to consolidate your findings and generate metrics and push the issues to your bug trackers and eventually to your developers for remediation. Why we security folks like AppSec pipelines? As I said earlier at the beginning of the talk, security people love process and flow. We live for it. And when we can see that and present that to upper management, they may not understand what Veracode is, but they'll understand that we've gone through all these steps to minimize the risk that they're going to get fired or their stock prices are going to go down or their reputation is going to be ruined. I wanted to focus in on one particular tool. How many people here have used or are familiar with the Burp Suite? Only one person. Well, I think every person in here should use it. It is my best friend because, as I said, as a security person, I am lazy. I do not want to have to write code every time to figure out everybody's web app. I'd rather just use something automated. I think this is a Java app. It's an integrated platform for performing security testing of web apps. These tools, there's a bunch of them in there that work seamlessly together. There's a free version and a paid version. The paid version is only $300 a year. It's probably the best investment you'll ever make. I don't care, even if your code is, 100 lines, you can crank through this thing and ensure that your code is secure before you roll it out. It gives you full control. You can combine manual techniques with automation. And well, anyway, it's an awesome tool. This is one of the particular tools in there. This allows you to inspect and modify traffic between a browser and a target application. Pretty simple, and ends up you're able to get usernames and passwords and other sorts of fun stuff that people allow their apps to leak. Spider allows you to crawl content and functionality. The scanner, which is probably the tool I use the most, it will test for OWASP top 10 as well as a lot of other types of vulnerabilities. Their approach is to detect server-side vulnerabilities by sending payloads as opposed to just sending blind injection, which is a much better way to test and can also detect a lot of things that would normally go undetected. They recently updated the tool. There was a Black Hat talk this year. They found a lot of threats exposed by server-side template injection vulnerabilities. If this was a security crowd, I would probably be firing up Burp and giving you examples, but I don't want to, in case I actually end up at your website and your app and I break it, I don't want to incur the ire of the DevOps community. So I chose to just do verbiage and give you a link to their research, and this ability to check web applications, dynamic data via web pages and emails is now a part of the Burp scanner, and you will get that tool if you subscribe to the $300 a year update cycle that Burp provides. The intruder tool does some customized attacks to exploit unusual vulnerabilities. This is more the manual side of things. You may not want to get down deep into the weeds on this, but if you have a more challenging app or one that has a lot of functionality, you might want to do a bit more what we call fuzz testing in the security community. And Burp Intruder is great for that. This is a quick and dirty slide on telling you what the comparison is in between the free edition and the pro edition. You can download it for free, play with it, decide whether or not it's worth having in your organization. I think it is. Just because hackers use it doesn't mean that DevOps people can't use it either. And it's very extensible, so it allows you to, it does come with a set of APIs that you can plug into your existing infrastructure. So, securing infrastructure. This is where I will rely rather heavily on my compadres at Rackspace. I am not a Chef or Puppet person, but I suspect that most people are familiar with this slide in terms of what Chef and Puppet can do. I've not played with it as much yet, and I wanted to bring up a tool here, and I cannot believe that. How do I get out of this so that I can pull up another window? Thank you. That'll do. This was a tool that debuted at Black Hat this year. I have just started to play with it because as a cloud security architect at Rackspace, we are going to soon be potentially supporting the AWS cloud, and we get a lot of questions regarding how to secure things in AWS. The name of this is Cloud Defigo. It's an open source tool. The guy just released it a few months ago. Did a talk again at Black Hat. It's an automated approach to securing infrastructure as a service. It's currently focused on Amazon Web Services EC2. It's available. You can download as a tarball. It's available on GitHub. Here's a typical workflow where, if you're familiar with AWS, management user executes a secure instance. The dynamic IAM role, which is a new approach by Cloud Defigo, is created with minimal permissions to perform the steps. This new instance is created within a remediation security group. When the instance starts for the first time, it performs software upgrade and installs prerequisites, and following successful installation, the instance attaches a new volume, performs full disk encryption in a secure manner. The encryption keys can then be stored on a hardware security module, but also you can do it on S3 by creating a dynamic policy, which is also a new approach by Cloud2Figo for the specific instance. And they executed this process by enforcing a pre-configured Chef policy on the instance. So it already works with Chef, and when all the configurations are completed, you can do a quick and dirty vulnerability scan that's executed by Nessus, which is an open source tool, which I'm assuming most people are familiar with. If not, nessus.org. It's another, quick and dirty free tool that you can use to make sure that, your application or your web server is not vulnerable to the obvious stuff. I started playing with it initially. I showed it to my compadre at Rackspace, John Yee. He's, I think, looking at it as well. But it has a lot of potential, not just for Amazon, but if it's extensible to other cloud environments as well, it can provide a heads up and a leg up to people trying to implement security in the cloud, as well as mitigate risks that certain enterprises or concerns that enterprises might have going into the cloud. This one is a new one. I have not yet played with this set of tools yet. One of my coworkers, Ray Cajones, stumbled across this site. It's a GitHub project that looks like it does some of the similar things that the Cloud2Figo does. But it reports its findings in CSV format, which is nice. A lot of people prefer that in terms of being able to remediate. We see CloudTrail config checks, IAM role config checks. So it's basically a sort of a best practices set of tools to ensure that your cloud implementation is reasonably secure before you set it out into the wild and into the world. So how did you do that again? Control. I'll just. There we go. So again, I think most people are very familiar with how these tools work. You can use them on the fly. You can tweak them as you need to. They work in the cloud. Cookbook stacks and playbooks. I mentioned before PowerShell. For Windows, PowerShell is your best friend. Has anyone here been working with Microsoft Azure yet? Their GUI is horrible. God bless PowerShell because you're going to be using it a lot. I did find it somewhat annoying that it took 45 minutes from pressing the return key for a VPN to come up. Literally, I was in a class, and we worked it so that the class was, we curated the VPN at the end of the day, so we hit return and we all went home. I've never seen that. I mean, they're going to have to work on that. The nice thing about Azure, though, is there is a lot under that hood. So there's a huge amount of potential there for those of the people who are interested. I'm not plugging Microsoft here, but their Azure platform is pretty neat once you get beyond that hard GUI. Grouping and tagging, this also works in the cloud. I'm sure this is stuff that's all familiar to people here. Inspectors like Jenkins and Linus, I think those are things that are essential, whether you're looking for security bugs or just general software bugs. Cloud Passage is one area where you can look at agents. Security people, there's a bit of a, I wouldn't say a renaissance, but a change of attitude in the security community with regards to IDS, host-based IDS, host-based IPS. We tried to experiment with it in the 2000s. It kind of worked, but it broke a lot of stuff, and it was very painful to implement, and certain applications worked with it and some didn't, so we abandoned it. But there's two companies, CrowdStrike and Cylance, who are on the cutting edge of doing this, and they're doing what's called behavioral analysis. They're looking at anomalies in how that application is running. Like, why is Adobe Acrobat suddenly FTPing to a server in the Ukraine? That's something that probably shouldn't happen, and we should either alert or stop. So if you're looking for an agent for pure software anomalies, Cloud Passage will work. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more security conscious, I highly recommend you look at CrowdStrike and Cylance. Rackspace uses CrowdStrike, and actually as part of our managed security services offering, that's the agent that will be installed on people's machines because it's very good at detecting anomalies. It's effectively a kernel level module, so hopefully that doesn't scare people. I just call it a kernel level rootkit, but kernel level module sounds nicer. Vulnerability scanning, I mentioned before. It is an essential part, I think, of securing your app, and it doesn't really take that long of a time. Nessus allows you to be automated. If you want to pay more money, you can use Rapid7 if you want a bit more bells and whistles. Familiar with Rapid7? Anyone here familiar with Metasploit? The creator of Metasploit, that's basically what Rapid7 is. They actually just went IPO, I think. Yeah. I use Metasploit because I'm a cheap bastard and don't want to pay $25,000 for a more extensive GUI tool, but Metasploit works just fine. I wanted to stick this in here because it's sort of my reach out to the DevOps community and something where perhaps you guys could help us. I think everyone's kind of familiar with this timeline. I was brought in after the fact to look at the period between November 30th and December 15th in terms of what could have been done better. And if you look at that period, they knew that they had been hacked, but they didn't know. They had the information, and they didn't act on it. The folks that hacked them, I mean, everyone kind of focused on the point of sale malware. Essentially, it was a RAM scraper. I mean, one person's RAM scraper is another person's forensics tool. If I'm going to look at, a compromised machine, I'm probably going to use that malware in a slightly different form and call it a forensics tool because I'm going to be looking at memory. So that's essentially what these guys did. I mean, there's a lot of steps here. You can see that at the beginning of September, they were certified as PCI DSS compliant. Yay. Compliance does not mean secure if you don't look at what you're doing. You could have all of this information, and what I discovered is that the attackers transmitted the stolen data to outside servers over the course of 2 weeks in plain text, FTP, and the folks at Target just either didn't care or weren't interested or didn't have any kind of egress filtering whatsoever. FTP should have been stopped and shouldn't have been allowed to traverse the target firewall. And if it did, there should have been controls in place. I mean, to at least confine it to particular FTP servers. I can't believe that Target really needed to have access to servers in Russia. I don't think they have any stores there. So, just a side comment. And same thing with FireEye. Both FireEye and Symantec. I like to beat up on Symantec because I've always thought that their tools were horrible, although they've gotten a little bit better over the years. But they provided the data there, and they just weren't able to act on it. And so they took advantage of weak security controls within Target for lateral movement. And I wish I could have shown the Ashley Madison information. That's still TBD, but I can take a good guess that once they got in the network, there was nothing to stop them to sit there and feast. And if anyone has downloaded the data, which I have, I really didn't care about. I didn't really care about the various people who were screwing each other's wives and husbands. I was more interested in how they got schema and enterprise admin passwords, which is kind of interesting. So again, the impact from December to May, pretty obvious. So question to ponder, how might a DevOps philosophy reduce the risk of that kind of breach occurring? And we have a prime example now of the Ashley Madison attack as well to look at, because I bet you if you look at that timeline, you're going to probably find some very similar things in it that they could have known what the problems were. Securing apps and APIs, let me go through these real quick. I'm guessing that this is familiar to most people. If you need to ask any questions about ThreadFix or any other these various tools, you can talk to my folks at Rackspace. I should have put the get management sold first up at the top, because if you can't get management buy-in for doing this stuff, that's usually what I found whenever I've gone into any organization, is that the network people, the development people, the operations people, they all know what the problems are, but they couldn't get management to listen to them. So that's kind of the great challenge. So key takeaways. Automation as much as possible. The security community needs to learn that just as much as anybody else. And we need to talk dev. I'm still a work in progress, according to John Yee on that. So I don't know all the. John Yee's a great guy, by the way. I keep mentioning him. He's our rack space point of contact for all things DevOps. But in conclusion, at the end, really just don't do stupid stuff. I mean, really, don't use outdated libraries. Don't use old hash standards. The people at Ashley Madison was just disclosed a couple days ago. They had encrypted their stuff using bcrypt, but some bright bulb decided to encrypt the username and passwords with MD5 hashes. Well, lo and behold, the hackers got a hold of them, put a bunch of GPUs together, and have now cracked most of those username and passwords, so the bcrypt encryption is now effectively useless. So, just don't do dumb stuff. Learn to use the tools that are around. Even something like Nmap. Has anyone here heard of Nmap? It's a port scanning tool. Thank you. It's a port scanning tool. Don't allow ports open that don't need to be open. And when they're open, make sure they're not disclosing the type of things that you don't want disclosed. So, at the end of the day, I think that the security community, just like the DevOps community, needs to learn that change is here, more is coming. And I think Darwin said it best, the smartest or the fastest are usually not the most successful. It's those that most adapt to change. So, and Machiavelli was a few hundred years before him. So anyway, there's 5 stages of grief. You can go through this: denial, anger. Oh, I can test it, no problem. Bargaining. Well, I can test it maybe in 2 days, or maybe after it's deployed. Or, I can just update my LinkedIn profile and go to the next job. That may be the choice of many software developers, but hopefully they get to the acceptance part, and hopefully folks like me in the security community can help you get there by embracing automation as well. So hopefully that talk was informative, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now or catch up with me while I'm out at the Rackspace booth. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we've actually already laid out lunch for you folks, so we're going to switch over to that. Just one note, we did, relative to yesterday, we had some requests, so we added some vegan meals there. If you're not vegan, please don't take the vegan meals because there are not many of them. Okay, let me know if you have any questions, and go eat.
You don't need to worry about it. No worries. Let's go over to. It's fine. I had to go the long way around to get back.
Getting back to your question, Slack channel stuff, you just keep it like, hey, I need this.
How would you have used it?
Well, for breakfast, we use they will manage for you or you can do it at their choice. Folks that are looking to opportunities like for the enterprise cloud because people like Google how can I leverage right up here? From the way up.
They encrypted on their end.
They encrypted on their end, but you can provide I go overboard. My advice is find something that works well. When you go off while maybe we just right now guys today find out. And then go over to what they tell you on something fine, especially now that we're offering managed security service. Finding ourselves tools offering services that come to us. We're not buying brand X managed by Rackspace. You're buying security services. Nice to meet you.
I think it's kind of a false sense of security. You take like Slack, for example, find an alternative to it, and it goes internally next to your security. Obviously, if somebody gets on your network, you're screwed anyway.
You have to think about this. You will be hacked. If all I do is compromise your web server information, it might be like a little pointer down in terms of for a day or two on CNN, but at the end of the day, it's rich data. But if I compromise your network, it takes several months to gather data, grab all the information I can, and then go out and sell it. It's a far more challenge today is being able to catch that viral group and spend all this money on remote hearings when in reality, it's all that communication. Our goal is to open ports in the firewall so that we can distribute. Okay, fine. Manage those ports. And once people get beyond those ports, what can they do?
What's the MITRE Corporation? Got all kinds of security in place, down to there's this, and for good reason. I mean, there is this anything that's outside of our firewall is going to be and will be, for whatever reason, by those third parties, or somebody compromises those third parties, or for some other reason that we can't control. So don't use those tools. Can't use any of that stuff. Keep it all in-house. However, you've got 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 developers. Can't stop them from going out and using these tools anyway. So it's like this cat and mouse game of trying to figure out
Let
should
me,
they be used,
let me
should they not
apologize.
be
I was
used.
having an issue with someone that worked on FedRAMP. I actually think that FedRAMP is I think it's a good place to start, and I think that DOT, as well as other government organizations, realizing that we suck. We need to start from scratch, our stuff away, but in order to move our stuff outside of us, we can't repeat the same mistakes that we did. So, lo and behold, FedRAMP is 1,500 people. You know, Amazon, Microsoft Azure have FedRAMP clouds that is completely separate from, you know, the rest of the cloud environment. You know, because of those controls. You can see, I mean, some of the controls are along the lines of things like, I know for you or I who have had drug use is sort of lack of drug use is kind of implied, but in the IT community, and I don't fault them for it. It's just, you know, and to be quite honest, the NSA gave up on drug testing a long time ago. The CIA has, and the FBI is moving towards it because qualifying talent. You know, I mean, I usually found security clearances, as long as you're honest, you're usually okay, but they're not particularly thrilled that you're wanting to be not like you tell them, yeah, I went to the Pink Floyd concert last night and went to the Pink Floyd concert last night. And if I need to apply anything else, then
But it's more of an indicator of personality flaw than killing your brain cells we don't want something.
fair enough. And I'm not saying that they're wrong in requiring that for FedRAMP, but it does require because, you know, when it comes to security, they don't want people to have a barrel.
Everybody's motivations can change as well. So
Exactly.
just because you're secure, you're cleared now. You know, in a month after reading
So
a book on some
I
security.
think what FedRAMP will first find its place level, less so the federal government, because as you know, the federal government only knows two speeds. Take them a while until they can get over there. The DoD does a better job than most agencies. They get hacked, but they don't get compromised as often. There's a difference. You know, if I break into your server, fine, but if I break into your server and go from there to where critical data is and then pull out this chart to the F-35 and email to the Chinese, that's compromised. Well, I know that's happening, but you know, by and large, the DoD is. I mean, it's improving too. I mean, I'm sure you told them. You know, I've read some of your point papers, not yours personally, but Mike does have a site where there's one issue I know that's of great concern to a lot of organizations is I don't think that cloud vendors have done a good enough job of explaining roles that are in place. Compromising. I mean, if you're running a server on there with a bunch of other people and you've implemented done your due diligence, you de-risk yourself. Problem with running that. You know, the only issue you know, some other organization or system organizations exhausting the CPU cycle, so you can't do what you need to do. And that to me is almost a bigger issue. But then again, that's where you come to Rackspace.
Hello?
Testing. Okay. Hey, folks, just settle down. We're going to start in just a moment here. Oh, yeah, I just unmuted.
Thank you.
Down, I should get a staple to myself. Okay, folks, we have our last talk of the day. We're going to be talking today, or I should say, Elliot is going to be talking about overcoming regulatory burden in startups. And like, I work with HIPAA data myself, so I know this is a huge pain point for me. I know it's a huge pain point for a lot of you too. Maybe it's PCI, maybe it's FERPA. A lot of you have data that you really have to worry about. If you're a big company, you might even have to worry about multiple countries worth. So this is a huge problem in DevOps adoption. That's why it's so important we talk about it. So Elliot is the founder of KindlyOps, a concierge DevOps service for healthcare startups. He's going to be reflecting on his experience building software for vulnerable populations. So he's already wired up with the mic. I'm just going to turn it over to him.
Great. I'm glad everybody showed up after lunch. I am going to try and convince you of why this matters in general, but then also why you should personally try and level up on security and privacy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current scene, what software is subject to regulations, who enforces those regulations, and then dive straight into some specific tactics for building fluency and proficiency. So this will, I think, dovetail nicely with some of the other talks we've had today and yesterday. And typically when you talk about regulation, most of the people I talk to immediately think of two groups in the US, PCI and HIPAA. I'm going to focus more specifically on HIPAA. I'm pretty sure most of you work for companies who have figured out how to charge money for things. With healthcare, it tends to not be as broadly understood, both how broad those regulations are and who they apply to. And in fact, a lot of people choose not to work on products that are targeted for healthcare because of the burden of working on those. So just a quick raise your hand. Who here works on healthcare software? And I mean, who works on software that's governed by regulations about safeguarding personal data? Right, so I see maybe 10 hands, and that's pretty common. I spent about 3 years working in a startup that was working very hard to comply with those regulations. We were doing software as a service for psychiatrists and their patients. And in a 10-person SaaS company, we estimated that compliance was around 30% of our costs. Our overall total costs of the company, around 30%, was in compliance. So that burden actually stops people from building new products that could make people's lives better, that could help people live longer, because of that cost and complexity. So purpose-built healthcare software actually is lagging significantly behind general purpose software because of those burdens. In general, where medical research is and where the current state of practice, the current state of practice is around 12 years roughly behind what we know. So we know how to make things better, and we're 12 years behind. So you can wake up in the morning, pick up a 10-year-old idea, implement it, and dramatically improve quality of care. But general purpose software is just exploding, right? Because it's perceived as easier to work on. It was really interesting yesterday. And Jennifer, in her talk, mentioned someone using PagerDuty to monitor glucose levels, right? That is a perfect example of general purpose software suddenly oozing into a healthcare-specific application because of its utility, because it's useful, it's easy to do, and you don't really want to stop people from exploring and using these useful tools. And the laws and the regulatory scene has changed in a very interesting way over the last couple of years, and it's going to continue down this trajectory. So for years and years, Amazon, for example, claimed that they didn't have to sign any kind of HIPAA-specific contract with you as a customer. They said, we're like the post office. If you send a medical record through the mail, you don't get a contract with the post office that they're going to safeguard that data. You put data into our data centers, it's your responsibility. Well, in 2013, Amazon suddenly started signing HIPAA business associate agreements. Google started signing them. Why did these big companies reverse their position? It wasn't out of the goodness of their heart. It was because the rules changed and said it doesn't matter whether you signed a contract or not. Those regulations trickle down. So if I have a medical app and I'm running it on Amazon, and there's a ticketing system that's a software as a service that I run, and my customer's data ends up in the ticketing system, and it gets disclosed, that the people who wrote and run that ticketing system are liable. It trickles all the way down, whether you had that agreement or not. So suddenly, the net of who this applies to is much, much larger, and it's going to continue in this direction. So, Internet of Things. Currently, January of this year, federal regulators said it's too soon. We don't know what rules to even make, but you can bet that over the next few years, the rules are going to pop up there because all of this information ends up being critical and closely linked to the safety of individuals. So what about those general purpose web services? Well, typically, security and privacy are neglected, right? We saw this mentioned in the last talk right before lunch. I would assert that typical engineers are much better at scaling than securing. Or typical application designs are much better at violating privacy rather than preserving dignity. And that's not because anybody has bad intentions. It's just a form of local optimization. Scaling hurts now, security hurts later. Privacy, well, that's complicated to even think about, right? It's really complicated to reason about. People have lots of work to do. There's really very real cost to spending a lot of time on this stuff. You know, I talked about that 30% overhead. Just like network configuration, the state of the art in security and privacy is really lagging far behind. So the path of least resistance is to build and run insecurely with minimal privacy protections. So this is my favorite question in the world. And I think it's a very appropriate question for this. Why should we care? Why should we work on this problem at all? Well, another name for security and privacy is safety. And it suddenly starts to sound like maybe that matters a little bit more when you use that name. Vulnerable populations are growing. People are vulnerable because of their social status, because of where they live, because of their gender, because of their age, because of chronic conditions. So those of us in this room right now, those of us who are like spending money to go out away from our jobs and attend a conference, I would say if we made a sweeping generalization, those of us in this room, we're at the least vulnerable of our lives, right? If you think about a baby's very vulnerable. You tend to go through this arc of becoming less vulnerable and then swing back again to becoming more and more vulnerable before you die. So we're all going to revert back to that vulnerable state. Right now, it might be the furthest thing from our mind. It might be as far as it ever gets from our minds. But right now, we're the ones who have the power to change how safe general purpose software is. We're the ones who are working on it and building it every single day. If you think about why those regulations exist in the first place, they exist because of an attempt to protect those vulnerable populations. So HIPAA enforcement. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but one of the bodies that enforces HIPAA is the Office of Civil Rights. Well, that tells you something right there, right? It is designed to protect vulnerable populations. So another example about software becoming part of the care pathway, I talked about ticketing software. When I was building this software as a service application that had medical records in it, finding a small ticketing vendor who had actually signed that agreement with us made our life immensely easier. And it meant that an individual therapist having a problem with our application could very easily report something to us, get it fixed right away, and help the person that much faster. I want to call them, Help Scout was the one. Help Scout will gladly, with no red tape, sign an agreement for you and not charge you anything extra. So because those requirements roll all the way down, if you're going after any sizable market at all, even if you don't think you're working on healthcare software, you probably should care about HIPAA compliance. So I want to make another concrete example about my claim that the current state of the art is not good enough for vulnerable populations. So I want to tell you a story about my friend Beth. After I tell you the story, I want to take a picture of you to bring back to Beth. Okay, so Beth gave me permission to use her picture and her story. She's very nervous about it, and she was very insistent. I promised not to disclose where she lives or some of the details about what happened. So Beth copes with two very profound vulnerabilities. So in addition to being poor, she has extremely limited muscle control. She's lived her whole life in a power chair, can barely move her arms. She can't hold her head up. She's also deaf. She's been deaf her whole life, so communication is a profound challenge. She can't speak verbally, and she can't hear. So most of the people who she interacts with, her care team, are not able to communicate with her at all, other than the most primitive pointing and putting food in front of her. So one example is, well, she's also very bright. So if you can see in the background, there's a computer there. Technology is her link. General purpose technology, not designed for her, is her link to her entire world. And so there's really two morals to the story about Beth. One is that any software, right, no matter how trivial it seems, can become part of the healthcare chain. And the other one is that we really are currently quite bad at operating safe web services. So some of Beth's challenges that are made worse by communication. Recently, staff was lifting her from her chair into her bed and was somewhat careless and tore the tendons out of her shoulder. So now she communicates, she tries to communicate using sign language, already has limited muscle control, and has had tendons torn out of her shoulder and can't tell anyone. She tries to tell people, but gets ignored. You know, oh, she seems fine, she seems fine. She hasn't said anything about it, right? She hasn't said anything about it. So the staff denied she needed medical attention. So within that context, Beth was very excited about this new, seemingly trivial app called Glide. So Glide is pretty neat. It's you could think of something like Snapchat. It's video messaging, right? So it's not a video call. It's not live, but it's quick back and forth. It's cross-platform, much closer to text messaging than to a video call. So using sign language, this is great. It's been a surprise hit in the deaf community. So remember that Beth is poor, so Beth doesn't have a cell phone lying around paying for a voice plan that she doesn't use. She has access to a video relay service, which gives a regular landline, and the government pays for a translator. So when she gets a phone call on that, an important call on that, an interpreter will pick up on the audio line, and then we'll call Beth on the video phone, and the screen will flash, and then they'll listen to what's said, translate it into sign language, get Beth's response, and translate it back. So that's great. That's been around for a long time. So in order to activate Glide, there's some clever two-factor auth anti-abuse stuff built in that requires an SMS verification. Well, that won't work because Beth doesn't have a mobile phone, but she does have a landline. So she gets in contact with support, emails support, and says, you know, this is the problem. Can you help me get this account activated so I can communicate with my friends? I can talk to them about what's happened to me. And they say, sure, no problem. We can call a landline. So what calls a landline? Some computer software. So as soon as the translator picks up the phone, you know, hi, I'm an interpreter. I'm answering for Beth. You know, I'm going to connect you now. I'm going to get her on the camera. The computer says 43 blah, 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 and hangs up. And there's a timeout. So that number has to be put back into the software to activate it. So Beth does have access to a video phone. She has all of these things that are supposed to be trying to help her, but the software inadvertently is like completely locking her out. So eventually she gets a few friends to help her defeat the security system, right? She has to get people who know sign language. She has to get people who are able to go physically and get access to the video phone. She has to do all of this stuff. And then she can get access and communicate with her friends and advocates, and then can seek assistance in getting care. She can have some surgery scheduled. And what she's going to talk about over Glide is risky details about who injured her. And by risky details, I mean like she's been threatened with being kicked out of the home for daring to ask for equipment that can transport her without injury, right? So this is why she didn't want me to say where she lives. So that is, like, I think, a very concrete example of why it's so important that we all care, who are building general purpose software, about increasing the safety of our software. So I want to take a picture of all of you, and so this, with 3 fingers, is the sign for I love you. And I want all of you to make a commitment that you're going to try and build a little bit of empathy for vulnerable people and apply that knowledge to the software that you work on. Okay, I want to take a picture of you holding your hands up and bring that back to Beth. Thank you. She's going to love that. So why us? That's why you should care in general. Why us? Why should we, the people at DevOps Days, care about this, even though most of us don't identify it as working in healthcare? Well, there's this great story, Plato's allegory of the cave. So in this story, there's people living inside the cave. There's light coming in. They see shadows on the walls, and that's reality. They don't know about the people who are outside the cave causing those shadows. They can't see them. And so in the DevOps community, we see shadows. We see the stories about security and privacy being super complicated. We hear the stories about the rules being burdensome, and we just sort of accept that indirect knowledge as reality. So in the allegory, when one's painfully dragged out of the cave into the light, it hurts. But eventually, after exposure to the sun and exposure to the people, they understand more of the world, what's causing the shadows. They have a greater understanding of reality. But when they return to the cave with their stories about that version of reality, people think they're damaged. People refuse to learn. So in this case, the reality outside is that the healthcare rules do apply to you. They apply to me. Even though enforcement is super far behind, even though regulations are super far behind, the goals, the reality is that this stuff matters to us. The utility of general purpose software is greatly outpacing the utility of special purpose software, and we really shouldn't try to stop it. So there's another version of this allegory, which is the Matrix, that mirrors that story very, very closely. And this is, I think, the most interesting character in the story, in the movie. It's a character that I find immensely inspiring as an archetype. So this is the keymaker. The keymaker can move between arbitrary worlds and contexts, just opening a door with a key. It can enter and leave many caves without being painfully dragged. So this character doesn't have the most traditional power, but you could argue that this character has the most ideal situation for being able to develop empathy. And of course, empathy and understanding of multiple worlds is the key to us who are practitioners of DevSecNet customer ops, right? We need to care about all of these worlds. We're the ones who are in the throes of building and running this general purpose software that everyone is using. It's oozing into every facet of our lives. And we're the ones who are making decisions today that are ultimately going to affect us personally as we transition back into vulnerable populations. We're the ones who are most able to understand the trade-offs involved in securely operating web services for the public. And in fact, we in this room have the ability to improve things faster than they can be legislated. Right? That's the idea of self-regulation. So let's go through some doors. So you'd think that an even simpler question than what are the rules is who enforces the rules? Who's going to come take my money and put me in jail if I do something that is considered harmful, that is bad? Well, it turns out that both of those questions are complicated. So just looking at HIPAA, the Office of Civil Rights is responsible for enforcing security and privacy rules. That's typically done when a complaint is received. One of the ways that a complaint is received is there is a big news article about a major breach. The state attorney generals have overlapping jurisdiction, so they started enforcing in 2010. The Food and Drug Administration is responsible for medical devices, so that seems totally unrelated, except that they've been grappling with understanding mHealth or mobile health. And when is it exactly that your smartphone turns into a medical device? The Federal Trade Commission is responsible for consumer protection, so they would get involved with large-scale breaches of consumer privacy or mishandling of customer data. So when an app on your phone is lying and spying on you and stealing your personal information and then discloses it and then you die, they would get involved if they have sufficient jurisdiction. And in all of those cases, the enforcement actions don't necessarily provide any sort of restitution to the injured party. So private lawsuits come into play. And so typically when you start thinking about security and privacy and enforcement, you start from this end trying to understand what are the rules, who enforces them, and it gets very overwhelming. You want to run back into the cave. So let's not do that. Instead, let's get really good at running safe, secure, privacy-preserving services. So when Glenn gave his opening remarks yesterday, he joked about not wanting to work with enterprises. And there's too much red tape, right? There's a lot of truth to that. A regulated environment can very easily be stifling to work in. And it's especially true if you start from that perspective. Start from the perspective of the rules rather than the perspective of the end goal, which is safeguarding that person. So I like to think about it like version control. Years ago, it was very complicated to set up version control. We didn't even have networked version control yet. It was 1, 2, or maybe more full-time engineers on a large project just to have version control set up. On a small project, you didn't use version control. Networked version control came along, distributed version control came along, and then collaboration tools came along that used version control as a fundamental component. And all of a sudden, it was slower to not use version control. We don't use version control today and collaboration tools like GitHub because we have deeply held philosophical views about it. We use it because that is the way to be the most effective. And we're currently still behind with security and privacy and safety. We need to make that leapfrog that where the easiest way to run something, the default, is the safe way. And the way we get there is to share stories. And so I'm trying to do my part to raise awareness by telling stories like this. And the more we all talk about running things securely, running things safely, like the talk just before lunch, sharing tips and tricks for how to run that, the faster we'll be able to make that transformation. So let's talk about tactics. Tactic number 1, well, even before tactic number 1, don't worry at all whether the rules apply to you. Just forget about that. They tend to start applying to you without much warning anyway. So it's much better to just try and do a good job. Of course, that leads to the problem of what is a good job. I can tell you what doesn't work. What doesn't work is trying to zero in completely on a checklist-based approach to compliance. Sure, I mean, putting encryption everywhere is great. Checking off key vulnerabilities is great. But it's not quite sufficient to count as a good quality job. Instead, we have to think about that larger goal. And in order to do that, we need to cultivate empathy. So tactic number 1, just as we develop fluency with organizational patterns and group behaviors, we talk about systems thinking, we talk about human error, we need to develop fluency with security and privacy, with safety. And we need to understand its connection to real people like Beth. So first, think about what needs to be safeguarded. What is personal information? In some cases, it's an IP address. Second, who's supposed to be safeguarded? So we can steal all of the techniques from the user experience design community. Here, use personas, use roles. Are we safeguarding a nurse, a patient, a CEO, a sysadmin? You need all of those roles and think about them and develop empathy for taking care of all of those people. So with that, we can develop controls that are both more effective and cheaper than what the regulations would steer you towards. So that's kind of a bold claim, right? But I want to back that up with a story about Common Ground, which is the app I worked on for a few years. So that's a web app that patients use with their psychiatrist. They end up putting in medical records. So the HIPAA privacy rules require that a covered entity, a doctor's office, can tell patients on request who their private information has been disclosed to. So that's the sort of thing that would real quick get muddled up with technical excuse making and finger pointing, right? With which parties does the law apply to? Like, how far down the chain does that apply? Which kind of disclosures have to be told about? Are there exceptions for psychiatric notes? Well, what can you get away with by wrapping up inside a terms of service disclaimer? Can we pay a lawyer to just tell you that everything's okay? It can get complicated and expensive very quickly. But if you stop and back up and think about why does this rule exist? What's the risk? And how does that risk show up inside this particular system? What's the intention? Who is being protected? Can we do it without introducing a lot of extra work? So the situation is that in a doctor's office, clinical staff have passwords to lots of information that they should not access. And there's a really practical and good reason for that. It's because of coverage. So if an emergency happens and I'm the one on call that weekend and my normal caseload is 20 patients, I have access to 200 patients because if that person shows up, I need access to their records to be able to help them. That is totally appropriate. But I can also misuse that power, right? And how do we detect that? So remember that enforcement happens when a complaint happens. So it's pretty easy to understand how a complaint would be filed when 100,000 patient records are stolen, right? That gets in the news. But how would a single person know that their record was misused by someone with the password? How would that abuse of power be detected and reported and complained about? It's super important. So what we did was put a dashboard in that shows the patient who's looked at their information that day, that week, and that month. Super, super simple. That was so much cheaper to build than the reports we initially thought we needed to build. It is so much more effective both at deterring abuse of power and at detecting abuse of power by the people who are supposed to be protected. We restored the dignity and the ability to know what's happening right to each individual patient. It took less than 2 weeks to build and roll out, and we were so proud of that. It gave people who were using the system tremendous confidence that the system was actually protecting them. And it gave the people who might have been tempted to just look at something that they shouldn't be looking at much more pause, knowing that anything they looked at, that person was going to see when they access that record. So just by thinking about the end goal and the person you're trying to help, it can end up saving you so much money and time and removing tons and tons of burden. So tactic number 2, read the rules. It's the most liberating step you can actually take. Once you have empathy for that person that you're trying to help or protect, reading the rules totally changes your understanding of what's allowed and what's not allowed. It is amazing how many people who are paid to work on this stuff never actually read the rules. There are so many policies and ways of doing things that are just totally etched in stone because of some third-hand corrupted information about what regulations require. Someone was teasing me about doing consulting work, and they said, it sounds like you basically just do reading as a service. And they're not wrong, right? Like the regulations are boring, and it's really easy to get lost. But what I'd ask is that you do this. Start a reading group, right? Carve it up into chunks, and then make a simple document with a mapping of each rule and policy that you have, connect it back to a specific regulation, why it exists. And I guarantee you will feel like you have less rules to deal with, and you will feel like you have more options available in order to comply with those rules. So you can ask yourself things like, as you do that, you'll start asking yourself things like, do we need this data at all? Like, you know that encrypting passwords is best practice, but what about encrypting everything else on the user model? Can the person decide to disclose this data? Like, it's a lot of times we think about like stacking locks all over everything, but can that person also have the right to disclose? Yeah, they have the right to disclose. And most importantly, how do we protect the customer against abuse of power by people with keys? Right? A lot of attention gets paid to defending against external attackers. The most important thing to think about is the small scale stuff, protecting individual people. And then the third tactic is to tell more stories. So you might say there was only 10 people who raised their hand, that they work specifically on products with these particular security goals. How can you gain experience and tell stories when you don't directly work on one of those products? Well, you can voluntarily adopt some requirements before the law says you have to. Now, I'm not saying that you go in and you tell your boss, hey, I want to volunteer to spend some money on regulations that don't apply to us. Like, that's a bad idea. But instead, why not take a couple of people, go to lunch, and do an informal risk assessment? Just talk about it. What are the risks? Pick the thing that's the highest risk and start chipping away at it. Tell the stories about how you're attacking that problem. If you're writing tools for others, include security and privacy concerns, safety concerns in your documents and tutorials. Every single one of us can get started with this. So there's in the past have been a lot of bad examples of this, of not telling these stories, not sharing these ideas. Configuration management examples that gloss over secrets management. That's gotten a lot better recently. Code examples from database vendors or language advocates that gloss over encrypted connections. Web frameworks or web service frameworks that default to like mutable data stores with no audit trail story. Or multi-factor authentication solutions that are getting pushed in everywhere and ignore the most vulnerable people in our society, the poor, the chronically ill, et cetera. But that's been changing. And I think those of us in this room can help increase the speed of that change. There's tons of good stories as well, right? So I want to call out Dustin Collins, who wrote this fantastic blog at Conjure about a maturity model for secrets and source control, right? That is exactly the kind of story that we need to be telling and internalizing and understanding. Amazon offering key management systems at a fraction of the cost of HSM. Wonderful developments. Google offering HIPAA BAA contracts at no extra charge. It's fantastic. Ansible has Vault. Chef has encrypted data bags, right? These tools are changing and growing up and maturing. Catalyze.io has published their entire set of internal policies, legal documents, and open source them for anyone to pick up and use and adapt for their own organization. So we just need to do more and more of this story sharing. In the future, there's lots and lots of potential for technology to actually catch up with safety concerns. So if you're interested in like cutting edge technical stuff, secure multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, where your servers can do work on the data without actually being able to unlock the data. There's so much potential here for us to do a really, really good job so that when we need it, these systems are ready to take care of us. That's it. Questions or you want help, please get in touch. I love talking about this stuff. I love helping people make their software, bend their software to take care of vulnerable populations. Thank you.
People have probably been submitting questions. Okay, well, thank you, Elliot. We're going to give you a chance to answer a few questions.
What is it?
Pollev.com / G2 Tech Group. Oh, you have it pulled up already? Well, it's loading here. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So the first one, how do you determine appropriate self-regulations before complaints or laws are registered? So you need a cycle where every 3 months or 6 months or a year, you got to decide what's appropriate for you. You do that risk assessment. And that's just having a frank conversation with yourself and with your leadership about what the risks are to the company and to the people who you're serving, and work on the top things. It's super specific to what you're doing, who you're serving, what data you have. But when you just carve out a couple of hours and talk about it, you'll find that you know what to work on. Do I believe that the software needs of vulnerable people are really heard and understood fully by the creators of said software? Absolutely not. And there is one surefire way to fix that. The surefire way to fix that is to take persons with lived experience and to include them on the development team, right? So in my opinion, the ideal healthcare startup is one that has both a researcher, scientist, doctor who deeply understands the medical side and a person with lived experience in the thing that they're trying to solve for, right? So if you're developing solutions that are supposed to make life better and safer for pregnant mothers, you better have a pregnant mother who has veto power on the design team at the very top level. And that is the only way to fix that. How can software reach a market with hundreds of different record standards? So I'm not a fan of a standards-based approach. I think the best thing to do is just for all of us to care about safety and to share stories about building stuff safely. And when that becomes the easiest way to do it, it'll just ooze everywhere, just like that general purpose software is oozing. The last one, what are ways that multi-factor authentication can be made more accessible? Well, number one, like one huge thing would be knowing that video phones exist, right? And then as you develop understanding and empathy for other vulnerabilities, other vulnerable conditions that people live with, you'll know how to do that, right? So just looking at, yeah, you can. I don't know that I have a full solution for like all the different ways of making multi-factor more accessible, but allowing people to break out of the system and talk with a real person who can apply judgment is probably the key thing that you can do there, not just leave them locked in a phone tree loop. Thank you very much.
Okay, so as I mentioned, that was the last talk of the day, and I think that this is a great one to wrap up on. To talk about the technology of this, adapting in a legacy system, the technology that you're really using of encryption, of security and access technologies, but also keeping in mind the audience, and in particular an audience that, as we've talked about with the charities, is often ignored in tech. So, you know, the last slot sometimes gets a bad rap. That's the reason why we gave the last slot, because we feel it ties it together well as we start to go into the open spaces, things to think about for today. Now, speaking of open spaces, Glenn is just bringing up the poll for that. Do you want to plug in and show that? Now, before you start voting, we're just going to do a few slight changes from yesterday. One, we had people have issues finding where the rooms were, particularly if you wanted to go visit multiple open spaces. So we're actually going to do a map this time. We will pull that up. One other thing that we noticed yesterday, the polling system we're using has a downvote system, and we're going to request that you don't use that because the way that open spaces work at a DevOps Days, you're supposed to use the rule of 2 feet. If you don't like a conversation, leave it. You don't need to downvote someone else's conversation because you're not interested in talking about it. Just go be in a different conversation. Downvoting something just makes everyone kind of feel bad about it. So we're not going to do that today. All right, now start submitting ideas. We're going to give you like 5 minutes or so. Try and be descriptive about this. Keep in mind you're not going to get a chance to explain this, so make sure this is something other people will know what you're talking about when you put it up there. Okay, thank you all.